Hi everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Rick Sanchez began as one of the sharpest nihilists on television, a character whose edge came from treating meaninglessness as absolute truth. But over Rick and Morty's many seasons, that edge has faded as the show explored his emotional depth, trauma, and consequences through serialized storytelling. By examining how Rick transformed from untouchable philosophical force into an explained and sympathetic character, we can understand what was gained and lost when the show chose humanity over horror. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Rick as untouchable nihilism. When Rick and Morty premiered in 2013, Rick Sanchez arrived on television as something genuinely unsettling. He was a character who took nihilistic philosophy and actually lived by it, without apology or compromise. Most shows that touch on nihilism treat it as a phase characters go through before learning better, or as a worldview held by villains who need to be defeated. Rick was different. He was the protagonist, the smartest person in the universe, and he genuinely believed that nothing in existence had inherent meaning or value. More importantly, he acted on this belief in ways that made viewers uncomfortable rather than entertained. Early Rick dismissed meaning at every level. In the pilot episode, Pilot, from season 1, Rick's very first adventure involves dragging Morty out of school in the middle of class to go on a dimension-hopping trip. When Morty protests that he has school and responsibilities, Rick dismisses these concerns immediately. School doesn't matter because education is just training people for jobs that don't matter in a universe that doesn't care. Morty's future doesn't matter because futures are illusions people create to avoid confronting the present. The entire social structure that gives school meaning is revealed by Rick as arbitrary convention with no deeper significance. This opening sequence establishes Rick's worldview through action rather than explanation. He doesn't need to deliver speeches about nihilism because everything he does demonstrates his philosophy. Taking Morty from school shows that social institutions are meaningless to Rick. Endangering Earth by bringing back interdimensional seeds shows that human life has no special value to him. Nearly killing Morty by flying drunk shows that individual safety doesn't register as important. The pilot episode presents Rick as someone who has eliminated every constraint that normal morality places on behavior. Rick's emotional detachment in these early episodes went beyond typical cartoon character callousness. He showed no empathy for suffering, no connection to other beings, and no recognition that pain or death were inherently bad things. In the pilot, Rick nearly destroys Earth by bringing back seeds from another dimension that attract alien attention. When Morty points out that this could kill everyone on the planet, Rick's response shows no concern for billions of lives. People dying isn't tragic to Rick because death is just matter rearranging itself into different configurations. The emotional weight that normal people attach to death is something Rick has completely eliminated from his worldview. Rick's intelligence was placed explicitly above any moral considerations. He could do things, so he did them, without asking whether he should. In early episodes, Rick's genius gave him godlike power over reality through his inventions and technology. He could create life, destroy civilizations, manipulate time, and travel between dimensions. Most stories about characters with godlike power explore the moral responsibility that comes with that power. Rick's story did the opposite. It showed a character with supreme power who rejected the entire concept of moral responsibility as a human invention with no basis in reality. The show established this pattern in episode after episode during season 1. In Anatomy Park from season 1, Rick shrinks Morty and sends him inside a homeless man's body to repair a theme park Rick built in the man's organs. When the homeless man dies with Morty still inside, Rick shows no concern for either the dead man or Morty's safety. He solves the technical problem of retrieving Morty, but expresses no emotion about the death or the danger. The homeless man was a convenient location for Rick's project, and his death is merely an inconvenience requiring a technical solution. Family bonds were treated as completely irrelevant to Rick in these early portrayals. He lived with his daughter Beth's family, but he showed no particular attachment to them beyond convenience. Beth wanted her father's approval desperately, but Rick seemed barely aware of her emotional needs. Morty was useful as a companion whose brainwaves masked Rick's genius brainwaves from detection, which is why Rick brought him on adventures. But Rick's stated reason for keeping Morty around was purely practical, suggesting no genuine affection or care for his grandson's well-being. In Raising Gazorpazorp from season 1, Morty accidentally fathers an alien child and struggles with the responsibilities of parenthood. Rick treats the situation purely as an inconvenient problem to solve, rather than as an opportunity to help his grandson learn about responsibility. When the alien child becomes violent and dangerous, Rick's solution is technical rather than emotional. He doesn't help Morty process what happened or learn from the experience. He just fixes the immediate problem and moves on, demonstrating his complete disinterest in emotional growth or family bonding. The show established Rick as a dominant philosophical force within its universe. Other characters would express normal human emotions and values, and Rick would cut through those emotions by pointing out their arbitrary nature. When characters were sad, Rick would explain that sadness was just chemicals in the brain with no cosmic significance. When characters wanted things, Rick would explain that desire was an evolutionary adaptation that no longer served any purpose. Rick had an answer for everything, and his answers consistently pointed toward the conclusion that nothing mattered, and attempting to create meaning was foolish. Rick's nihilism functioned as a kind of superpower in early episodes. While other characters were constrained by their beliefs in right and wrong, their emotional attachments, and their hopes for the future, Rick was free from all these constraints. He could make any choice without guilt, abandon any situation without regret, and pursue any goal without questioning whether it was worthwhile. This freedom made him supremely capable and dangerous in equal measure. He could solve any problem because he wasn't limited by caring about the consequences of his solutions. The pilot episode demonstrated Rick's worldview through action rather than just dialogue. Rick builds a bomb to destroy the world if his demands aren't met. When Morty questions whether Rick would actually destroy all life on Earth, Rick confirms that he absolutely would, because there are infinite other Earths in infinite dimensions. One Earth being destroyed means nothing when infinite versions of Earth exist elsewhere. This casual willingness to commit genocide establishes Rick as someone who has genuinely internalized nihilistic philosophy to its logical extreme. Early Rick showed no character growth or learning. Most television protagonists evolve over time, learning from mistakes and becoming better people. Rick stayed exactly the same because he didn't believe that becoming better meant anything. There was no better or worse, only different configurations of matter and energy. Growth implies progress toward a goal, but Rick recognized no valid goals. He was perfectly static because he had already reached the conclusion that change was meaningless unless it served his immediate pleasure or convenience. The relationship between Rick and Jerry in early episodes exemplified Rick's nihilistic dominance. Jerry represented conventional values, normal ambitions, and belief in social structures. He wanted a job, a stable family, and respect from others. Rick treated Jerry with open contempt, not because Jerry was particularly contemptible, but because everything Jerry valued was revealed by Rick as arbitrary and meaningless. Jerry worked at an advertising agency, creating campaigns to make people buy products they didn't need. Rick saw this clearly and made sure Jerry knew that his life's work was completely pointless. In Something Ricked This Way Comes from Season 1, Jerry takes a job at a theme park called Anatomy Park that operates inside homeless people. He's excited about this opportunity and sees it as important work. Rick mocks Jerry's excitement because the job is absurd and meaningless, just like every other job. Jerry's need for employment and purpose is treated by Rick as a weakness that Rick has transcended. The contempt Rick shows Jerry is philosophical rather than personal. Rick doesn't hate Jerry specifically. He looks down on everything Jerry represents about normal human needs for meaning and validation. Rick's physical appearance reinforced his nihilistic character. He was always drunk or drinking, suggesting he needed to numb himself against reality. His lab coat was stained and worn because he didn't care about appearance or social presentation. He drooled constantly, a physical sign of his degradation and his lack of concern for how others perceived him. His spiky blue hair stood up wildly, as if he couldn't be bothered to manage even basic grooming. Everything about how Rick looked told viewers that this was someone who had stopped caring about the things normal people care about. The early episodes presented Rick's nihilism without judgment or commentary. The show didn't tell viewers that Rick was wrong, or that his philosophy was harmful. It simply showed Rick operating according to nihilistic principles, and let viewers draw their own conclusions. This was part of what made Rick unsettling. The show wasn't condemning his worldview or setting him up to learn better. It was presenting nihilism as a genuinely viable philosophy that produced certain results, And those results included tremendous capability combined with tremendous emptiness. Rick's dialogue in early episodes was sharp and cutting in ways that later seasons would soften. He would make observations that were philosophically accurate but emotionally devastating. When Morty worried about failing a test, Rick would point out that the test measured nothing important, and that Morty's education was preparing him for a meaningless existence anyway. When Summer was upset about social problems at school, Rick would explain that social hierarchies were arbitrary power structures that would dissolve the moment everyone left high school. Rick's intelligence was weaponized against the illusions that let people function in daily life. The show established that Rick was right within the show's universe. His observations about infinite dimensions, the meaninglessness of individual actions, and the arbitrary nature of values were confirmed by what viewers saw. This was crucial to Rick's edge. He wasn't a cynic who happened to be wrong, which would make him a fool. He wasn't a pessimist exaggerating problems, which would make him tiresome. He was someone who saw reality clearly and responded to that reality logically. The show validated his worldview, even as it showed the costs of that worldview. Early Rick represented something genuinely transgressive on television. Most shows, even adult animated comedies, ultimately affirm conventional values. Characters might behave badly, but the show punishes bad behavior, or at least acknowledges it as bad. Rick was different. He rejected conventional values completely, and the show let him. He was the protagonist, the character with the most screen time and the most capability, and he was allowed to maintain his nihilistic philosophy without the show undermining or contradicting it. This made Rick dangerous and exciting in ways that typical animated comedy characters were not. Rick's edge in early seasons came from his untouchability. Nothing could hurt him because he didn't care about anything deeply enough to be hurt by its loss. Nothing could change him because he didn't believe change toward any particular goal mattered. Nothing could teach him because he already understood everything worth understanding. He existed as a fixed point of pure nihilistic philosophy made flesh, and that fixedness was what gave him his characteristic sharpness. He was a blade that couldn't be dulled because he was already reduced to his essential core, with nothing extra to wear away. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But Rick's nihilism wasn't just philosophy in early episodes. It was the source of a very specific type of humor that made audiences deeply uncomfortable. Section 2. Nihilism as discomfort comedy. Rick's nihilism in the early seasons of Rick and Morty functioned as a specific comedic device that distinguished the show from other adult animated comedies. The humor wasn't just that Rick was cynical or pessimistic. The humor came from Rick applying his genuine nihilistic worldview to everyday situations in ways that revealed how much normal life depends on shared illusions and unspoken agreements about meaning. This created a type of comedy based on discomfort, where laughter came from recognition of truths that most people avoid thinking about. Understanding how Rick's nihilism produced this discomfort humor helps explain what made early Rick so distinctively sharp, and why later softening of his character changed the show's entire comedic tone. The cold humor in early episodes came from Rick treating serious matters as trivial and trivial matters as serious, based on his nihilistic framework. In the episode Meeseeks and Destroy from Season 1, the family summons Mr. Meeseeks, creatures designed to fulfill simple requests and then disappear from existence. When Jerry asks a Meeseeks to help him take 2 strokes off his golf game, the task proves more difficult than expected. Multiple Meeseeks are summoned to help, and their existence extends painfully as they fail to complete the simple task. The Meeseeks become desperate and suicidal because their existence has meaning only if they complete their purpose. Rick finds this hilarious, while others find it disturbing. The humor comes from the contrast between how Rick sees the situation and how everyone else sees it. Rick watches these creatures suffer existential agony over something as meaningless as a golf score and laughs because he sees the absurdity clearly. The Meeseeks think their suffering matters because they can't complete their purpose. But Rick knows that purpose itself is arbitrary, that golf is a meaningless game, and that the entire situation is ridiculous from top to bottom. The comedy works because viewers can see both perspectives simultaneously. We understand Jerry's desire to improve at golf and the Meeseek's suffering, but we also recognize Rick's point that all of this anguish is over something completely trivial. Rick's emotional dismissal served as the punchline to countless jokes in early seasons. A typical setup would have another character expressing emotion or concern about something, and Rick's response would undercut that emotion by revealing its meaninglessness. In Lawnmower Dog from Season 1, the family's dog Snuffles gains human-level intelligence through Rick's invention. The dog creates an army of intelligent dogs who enslave humans, reversing the traditional power dynamic. When this happens, normal people would focus on the horror of being enslaved, or the tragedy of the family's beloved pet turning against them. Rick's focus is purely on the technical problem of how to reverse the intelligence enhancement. The emotional dimensions don't register for him as relevant to solving the problem. This pattern of emotional dismissal as punchline worked because it revealed something true and uncomfortable. Most humor depends on shared emotional frameworks. We laugh at someone slipping on a banana peel because we share an understanding that the person's dignity has been violated in a harmless way. Rick's humor attacked the shared frameworks themselves. When he dismissed emotional responses as meaningless chemical reactions, he was technically correct within a materialist worldview. The laughter came from the discomfort of having your emotional reality reduced to mechanics. Rick consistently unsettled viewers by responding to situations in ways that violated expected emotional norms. In Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1, when Rick and Morty abandon their original dimension after turning everyone into monsters, they bury their own corpses and take over the lives of dead versions of themselves. Morty is traumatized by this experience and has to bury himself. Rick shows no emotional response at all. He's done this before and will do it again because dimensions are interchangeable. A normal show would play this scene for horror or pathos, focusing on Morty's trauma. Rick and Morty plays it for both horror and dark comedy, with Rick's total lack of response creating the comedic element through contrast with Morty's distress. The scene where they bury themselves became iconic because it captured the show's unique comedic tone. Morty stands there covered in dirt, having just shoveled soil over his own dead body, experiencing genuine psychological trauma. Rick stands next to him, completely calm, offering no comfort or acknowledgement that anything unusual has happened. The contrast between Morty's horror and Rick's indifference creates dark humor that makes viewers laugh while feeling uncomfortable about laughing. We're complicit in Rick's perspective, even as we recognize how disturbing that perspective is. The show made Rick's detachment his entire identity in these early seasons. His character was built around the absence of normal human emotional reactions. This made him function almost as an alien presence in a human world. He looked human and lived among humans, but his internal experience was completely different from typical human consciousness. This alien quality was funny in a disturbing way, because it revealed how much human social interaction depends on shared emotional responses that we rarely articulate or examine. In Night Shame Aliens from Season 1, Rick is trapped in a simulation designed to steal his secrets. He figures out he's in a simulation almost immediately, but plays along to see what happens. When other characters are panicking about the situation or trying to escape, Rick treats it as entertainment. His emotional detachment allows him to recognize the simulation because simulated reality feels no different to him than actual reality. Both are equally arbitrary configurations of matter following physical laws. The joke is that Rick's nihilism makes him unmanipulable because manipulation requires caring about something. Rick's nihilism as comedy worked because the show trusted its audience to handle genuinely dark and uncomfortable material. Most comedies, even adult ones, provide reassurance that everything will be okay and that characters we care about are safe. Early Rick and Morty offered no such reassurance. Rick would do genuinely terrible things with no indication that he would face consequences or learn lessons. The audience had to sit with the discomfort of watching a protagonist behave in ways that most shows would reserve for villains. The humor also came from watching other characters try to apply normal frameworks to Rick's behavior and fail. Beth would try to parent Rick or set boundaries with him, but her attempts would collapse because Rick didn't recognize parental authority as meaningful. Morty would try to get Rick to care about things Morty cared about, but Rick would explain why those things didn't matter. Jerry would try to assert himself as the man of the house, but Rick would casually demonstrate Jerry's complete irrelevance. The comedy came from watching normal social structures and emotional appeals bounce off Rick's nihilistic armor. Rick's dialogue in early episodes was written to maximize discomfort through precision. He wouldn't just dismiss things generally, he would articulate exactly why they didn't matter. in ways that were hard to argue with. When Beth worried about her children's emotional well-being, Rick would point out that well-being is a subjective experience with no objective standard, and that Beth's concern was really about her own anxiety being projected onto her children. This precision made Rick's nihilism more unsettling because he wasn't just being contrarian. He was applying genuine philosophical rigor to everyday life in ways that destroyed the foundations of normal interaction. The show used Rick's perspective to make mundane situations surreal and disturbing. A normal family dinner became an examination of the meaningless rituals humans perform to maintain social bonds that serve no cosmic purpose. A trip to the grocery store became an exploration of how commercial systems create artificial desires to drive consumption of unnecessary products. Rick's lens transformed normal life into something alien and absurd, and the comedy came from recognizing that his perspective revealed truths we normally ignore. Rick's nihilism as comedy also worked because it was rarely preachy or self-important. Rick didn't spend long stretches explaining his philosophy or trying to convince others to adopt his worldview. He simply lived according to his nihilistic beliefs and let those beliefs manifest in his choices and reactions. This made his nihilism feel genuine rather than performative. He wasn't trying to shock people or make philosophical points. He was just being himself. And himself happened to be someone who had genuinely internalized that nothing matters. The physical comedy in early episodes often reinforced the nihilistic themes. Rick would casually kill people, destroy property, or cause mayhem without the exaggerated reactions typical of cartoon violence. The violence wasn't played for slapstick laughs where characters bounce back unharmed. It was played as genuinely destructive action that Rick performed without hesitation because he saw no moral distinction between breaking an object and breaking a person. Both were just rearranging matter from one configuration to another. In Anatomy Park, Rick sends Morty into a homeless man's body, and the man dies while Morty is still inside. The man's body is then enlarged to massive size and explodes in the middle of a public square during Christmas. Rick's response to this grotesque public spectacle is to note the technical achievement of successfully enlarging the body. He shows no concern for public safety, for the trauma this causes witnesses, or for the dignified treatment of the dead man's remains. The joke is that Rick sees only the scientific accomplishment, while everyone else sees horror. Rick's drinking functioned as part of the nihilistic comedy. He was constantly drunk or drinking, using alcohol to numb himself against the reality he understood too clearly. The drinking wasn't portrayed as a serious problem requiring intervention, at least not in early seasons. It was just part of who Rick was. Another manifestation of his response to meaninglessness. The comedy came from watching Rick navigate dangerous situations while intoxicated, solving complex problems while barely able to stand straight, maintaining his intellectual superiority while physically degraded. The show also created humor from the gap between Rick's capabilities and his emotional emptiness. He could do almost anything, build almost any device, solve almost any problem, but he couldn't make himself care about anything. This contradiction was funny in a dark way. Here was someone with godlike power who used that power mostly for distraction and momentary pleasure because he saw no point in accomplishing anything meaningful. The waste of his potential was simultaneously tragic and absurd. Rick's relationship with adventure itself revealed his nihilism through comedy. In most adventure stories, characters go on quests because they want to achieve something important. Rick went on adventures purely as distraction from existence. He didn't care about the outcomes. He didn't invest emotionally in success or failure. The adventures were just things to do, marginally more interesting than sitting still. This attitude toward adventure inverted normal narrative structures and created humor through subversion of expected emotional engagement. The comedy of Rick's nihilism was enhanced by the show's animation style and voice acting. Justin Roiland's vocal performance as Rick included constant burping, stuttering, and verbal tics that made Rick sound simultaneously brilliant and degraded. The animation showed Rick's expressions as often blank or sardonic, rarely showing genuine emotion. These stylistic choices reinforce that Rick existed in a different emotional register from other characters. Early Rick and Morty used Rick's nihilism to comment on other media and storytelling conventions. By having a protagonist who genuinely didn't care about typical story stakes, the show could interrogate why audiences care about those stakes. Why does it matter if the hero saves the day when there are infinite dimensions where the day wasn't in danger? Why does character growth matter when all personalities are just temporary configurations of matter? Rick's nihilism made every adventure simultaneously exciting and meaningless, and that contradiction was the source of a unique type of comedy. The discomfort comedy worked because it made viewers complicit in Rick's nihilism while watching. We laughed at Rick's cold dismissals because they were clever and because they revealed truths we recognized. But laughing meant acknowledging those truths, which meant participating in the dismantling of the frameworks we use to find meaning. The show created a strange dynamic where enjoying Rick's character required accepting, at least temporarily, premises that made enjoyment itself seem irrational. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. But this nihilistic comedy couldn't exist in a vacuum forever, and the show began introducing consequences that would gradually undermine Rick's untouchable edge. Section 3. Croninberg World introduces weight. The episode Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1 represents the first major crack in Rick's untouchable nihilistic armor. This episode took Rick's philosophy of consequence-free dimension hopping and revealed that consequences exist even when Rick personally escapes them. By examining this episode closely, we can see the beginning of a pattern that would eventually erode Rick's edge completely. The episode introduced the idea that Rick's actions have weight, and that escaping to another dimension doesn't actually erase what happened. It just moves Rick away from having to witness the results of his choices. The episode begins with a typical setup. Morty has a crush on a girl named Jessica at his school. There's a school dance coming up, and Morty desperately wants Jessica to notice him and like him back. This is normal teenage anxiety that most viewers can relate to. Morty asks Rick for help, and Rick agrees to make a love potion that will make Jessica attracted to Morty. This already crosses ethical lines, because the potion removes Jessica's free will and forces her to feel attraction she wouldn't naturally feel. A love potion is essentially a date rape drug in liquid form, making someone desire you against their actual preferences. Rick creates the potion using DNA from a vole, an animal that mates for life. The idea is that Jessica will fall in love with Morty permanently once she's exposed to the potion. Morty uses the potion at the school dance, and it works immediately. Jessica becomes obsessed with Morty in an exaggerated way that makes him uncomfortable. The potion worked too well, making Jessica's attraction desperate and intense rather than natural and romantic. This should have been a lesson about the dangers of trying to manufacture emotions or manipulate people's feelings. The situation gets worse when Jessica has a cold. She sneezes while under the influence of the love potion, and the potion becomes airborne. Everyone at the dance who is exposed to Jessica's sneeze falls in love with Morty. Within minutes, dozens of people are chasing Morty around the school, all desperately trying to get to him. Morty is terrified because he's being mobbed by people whose agency has been completely overridden by Rick's invention. The potion has escaped containment and is spreading through the school. Rick's first solution is to create an antidote using DNA from other animals. He tries to reverse the love potion's effects by introducing genetic material that will counteract the vole DNA. This is Rick doing what he always does, solving a technical problem with more science. He doesn't pause to consider whether this approach is safe or ethical. He just applies more technology to fix the problem that technology created in the first place. This pattern of using science to escape from the consequences of science is central to how Rick operates. The antidote fails catastrophically. Instead of curing the love potion, it combines with the flu virus that Jessica had and causes massive genetic mutations. People who were infected with the love potion begin transforming into grotesque monsters. Their bodies twist and deform into horrible shapes that resemble the body horror imagery from filmmaker David Cronenberg's movies. These monsters are called Croninbergs by the show, and they spread the mutation to everyone they touch. Within hours, the entire human population of Earth has been transformed into Croninbergs. Rick tries a second antidote, but this one makes things even worse. The Croninbergs mutate further into even more disturbing forms. At this point, most characters would recognize that they've made a catastrophic mistake and would dedicate themselves to fixing it no matter how long it took. Most stories about disasters focus on the protagonist's efforts to repair the damage they caused and make things right. Rick doesn't do this. Instead, he tells Morty they're going to abandon this dimension entirely and move to a different one where the problem doesn't exist. Rick explains to Morty that there are infinite dimensions across the multiverse. In some of those dimensions, a different Rick and Morty successfully cured the Croninberg plague, but then died in an unrelated accident. Rick and Morty can go to one of these dimensions, bury the dead versions of themselves, and take over their lives. Nobody will know the difference because these versions are identical up until the point of death. The plan is technically brilliant and solves Rick's immediate problem of having destroyed his home dimension. Rick and Morty travel to a new dimension and find the dead bodies of that dimension's Rick and Morty. They bury these corpses in the backyard of this new dimension's version of the Smith house. Morty has to dig a hole and bury his own dead body, then help Rick bury Rick's dead body. This is deeply traumatic for Morty. He's confronted with his own mortality in the most direct way possible. He sees what he looks like dead. He has to physically handle his own corpse and put it in the ground. This experience shatters something in Morty's innocence. Rick shows absolutely no emotional response to burying himself. He's done this before and sees it as a purely practical matter. A body is just matter that needs to be disposed of efficiently. The fact that it's his own body from another dimension doesn't make it emotionally significant to him. This demonstrates Rick's nihilism in action. He's buried himself before and will probably do it again. Death and mortality don't affect him because he sees them as inevitable rearrangements of atoms with no deeper meaning. After burying the bodies, Rick and Morty enter this new dimension's house and take over the lives of the dead Rick and Morty. The family has no idea that these aren't their original Rick and Morty. Beth, Jerry, and Summer continue living their lives without knowing that the Rick and Morty they're interacting with are technically different people who abandon their own dimension. The episode ends with Morty sitting at the dinner table looking traumatized, while his family talks around him, completely unaware of what just happened. What makes this episode so significant is that it introduces real consequences that persist even after Rick escapes. The original dimension that Rick and Morty came from still exists. Beth, Jerry, and Summer from that dimension are still living in the Croninberg hellscape that Rick created. They didn't get to escape. They have to survive in a world of monsters where human civilization has collapsed, and most people have been transformed into grotesque creatures. Rick destroyed their world and then left them to deal with it. The show doesn't let viewers forget about the original dimension. In later episodes, we see that original Jerry and Beth are still alive in the Croninberg world. They've adapted to their horrific new reality and actually become closer as a couple because they only have each other. They wear armor made from Croninberg parts and fight to survive every day. Their lives are incredibly hard, but they're making it work. This revelation is important because it shows that Rick's actions have lasting effects that continue even after he stops witnessing them. Rick's solution to the Croninberg disaster reveals the limits of his nihilistic philosophy. He believes that dimensions are interchangeable and that moving to a new dimension is equivalent to fixing the problem. From his perspective, he and Morty are now in a dimension where Earth is fine, so the problem is solved. The fact that they destroyed another Earth doesn't matter because that Earth is in a different dimension that they'll never see again. Rick has solved his problem by running away from it rather than fixing it. This introduces a moral question that challenges Rick's nihilism. Is abandoning a destroyed dimension the same as never having destroyed it? Rick would argue yes, because the outcome for him personally is identical. He's in a dimension with a functioning Earth either way. The show suggests no, because the destroyed dimension still exists, with people still suffering in it. Rick's philosophy allows him to escape personal consequences, but it doesn't erase the consequences themselves. They just happen to people Rick will never see again. The episode also shows how Rick's dimension-hopping ability creates a moral hazard. Because Rick can escape to a new dimension whenever things go badly, he has less incentive to be careful or to fix his mistakes. If he destroys a planet, he can just move to a dimension where that planet isn't destroyed. This removes the normal feedback mechanism that teaches people to be more careful. When your actions have no lasting consequences for you personally, there's no practical reason to avoid catastrophic mistakes. Morty's trauma from this experience is the first indication that someone in the show will carry emotional weight across episodes. Morty buries himself and is forced to confront the reality of what dimension hopping means. He can't unsee his own corpse. he can't forget that his original family is living in a nightmare world that he and Rick created. This knowledge changes Morty in ways that persist throughout the series. He becomes more cynical, more willing to accept terrible things, and more traumatized by each new adventure. The episode establishes that Rick can escape personal consequences, but cannot erase consequences entirely. This is a crucial distinction. Rick's nihilism tells him that if he doesn't personally experience negative outcomes, then those outcomes don't matter. The show challenges this by showing that outcomes still exist and still affect people, even when Rick doesn't witness them. The Croninberg World continues to exist. The people there continue to suffer. Rick's philosophy allows him to ignore this, but it doesn't make it untrue. Rick Potion number 9 introduces the idea that Rick's adventures leave wreckage behind them. Every dimension Rick visits potentially becomes worse because of his presence. Every problem he solves might create bigger problems that he escapes before having to deal with. This pattern of leaving destruction in his wake undermines the idea that Rick's nihilism is consequence-free. The consequences are very real for everyone who isn't Rick. The episode also reveals Rick's capacity for abandonment. He abandoned his original family to escape the consequences of his actions. He's willing to leave behind everyone and everything if staying becomes inconvenient. This is nihilism taken to its logical extreme. If nothing matters and everyone is replaceable, then abandoning people is no different from staying with them. Rick acts on this logic, showing that his philosophy isn't just theoretical. He actually lives according to these principles, even when doing so means betraying and abandoning his own family. Morty's response to being forced to bury himself and abandon his family represents normal human psychology confronting nihilistic philosophy. Morty is traumatized because he has normal emotional responses to death, loss, and abandonment. He can't just dismiss these experiences as meaningless, even after Rick explains that they technically are meaningless. Morty's trauma reveals that knowing something is cosmically meaningless doesn't eliminate the psychological impact of experiencing it. The episode works as entertainment, while also functioning as philosophical commentary. The Croninberg transformation is visually creative and horrifying. The escape to a new dimension is an exciting science fiction concept. The emotional beat of Morty burying himself is genuinely effective. The episode succeeds on multiple levels simultaneously, which is part of why it's so significant to the show's evolution. It proved that Rick and Morty could do consequences and emotional weight without losing its edge or entertainment value. Rick Potion number 9 marked the beginning of serialization in Rick and Morty. Before this episode, each adventure was self-contained with no lasting effects. After this episode, viewers knew that actions could have permanent consequences. Morty's trauma persists. The abandoned dimension continues to exist. The show had created continuity and weight that would accumulate over time. This was the first step toward eroding Rick's untouchable status, because untouchability requires that nothing ever matters or changes. The episode also planted seeds for later character development. Morty's willingness to bury himself and continue living in the replacement dimension shows him beginning to internalize Rick's philosophy. He's learning to accept terrible things and move on without processing them emotionally. This corruption of Morty's innocence becomes a running theme in the series. Rick isn't just taking Morty on adventures, he's gradually transforming Morty into someone more like himself. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The introduction of real consequences showed cracks in Rick's philosophical armor, and those cracks became more visible when examining how Rick deploys his intelligence specifically to avoid emotional processing. Section 4. Genius as emotional avoidance. Rick's supreme intelligence serves multiple functions in the show, solving impossible problems, and enabling incredible adventures. However, examining Rick's behavior closely reveals that he often uses his genius as a tool for avoiding emotional engagement, rather than for productive purposes. This section explores how Rick deploys scientific solutions to bypass emotional processing, how he uses intellectual control as a substitute for genuine human connection, and how his avoidance of vulnerability through constant problem-solving represents a fundamental misuse of his capabilities. Understanding this pattern helps explain how Rick's edge began to dull as the show made his avoidance strategies increasingly visible and ultimately ineffective. Rick consistently responds to emotional situations by creating technical solutions instead of engaging with the emotions themselves. When faced with problems that require emotional processing, self-reflection, or difficult conversations, Rick builds devices, invents solutions, or escapes to other dimensions. This pattern appears throughout the series, becoming more obvious as the show progresses. In early seasons, Rick's scientific solutions seem like demonstrations of his genius. In later seasons, they increasingly appear as elaborate avoidance mechanisms that prevent Rick from dealing with his psychological issues. The episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2 demonstrates this pattern clearly. Rick reunites with Unity, a hive mind entity he has a romantic history with. Unity controls the population of an entire planet, and Rick uses this to orchestrate elaborate parties and experiences using the bodies Unity inhabits. The relationship between Rick and Unity reveals genuine affection on both sides. They have history together and understand each other in ways that Rick doesn't connect with other beings. When Unity realizes the relationship is toxic and leaves Rick, Rick responds to heartbreak and loneliness by attempting suicide. He doesn't talk to anyone about his feelings or seek support from his family who are in the house with him. Instead, he goes to his garage, sets up a device to disintegrate himself, and positions his head under a laser while sad music plays. The scene shows Rick writing equations on a whiteboard, methodically preparing the device, and finally sitting down beneath it with his eyes closed. The moment stretches out uncomfortably long, making viewers sit with the reality of what's happening. The scene is played seriously rather than for comedy, showing Rick at his lowest point. Only Morty's accidental interruption when he stumbles into the garage drunk saves Rick's life. This suicide attempt reveals that Rick's scientific approach to problems extends even to his own psychological pain. He experiences unbearable emotional suffering, and his solution is technological rather than emotional. He builds a laser, writes equations, and positions himself for physical destruction. The approach is quintessentially Rick because it uses intelligence and technology to avoid dealing with emotions directly. Suicide becomes another technical problem with a technical solution rather than a cry for help or a moment requiring human connection. Rick's tendency to turn himself into things represents another form of emotional avoidance through science. In Pickle Rick from Season 3, Rick transforms himself into a pickle to avoid attending family therapy. Beth has scheduled family therapy and wants everyone to attend. Rick could have simply refused to go, which would have been honest and straightforward. Instead, he creates an elaborate scientific scenario that makes attending therapy physically impossible. He removes his own ability to participate in emotional work by changing his physical form into something that cannot sit in a therapist's office and talk about feelings. The pickle transformation demonstrates how Rick uses his intelligence to create increasingly complex excuses for avoiding simple emotional tasks. Therapy requires sitting still, being honest about feelings, and listening to others. These are simple actions that don't require scientific genius, yet Rick finds them unbearable. So he invents a serum that turns him into a pickle, knowing this will prevent him from attending therapy. When the plan goes wrong and he ends up in a sewer after a cat knocks the antidote syringe out of reach, Rick builds a body out of rat parts and fights his way through a secure Russian facility, rather than admit he's afraid of vulnerability. The episode makes Rick's avoidance explicit when Dr. Wong, the family therapist, directly points out what Rick is doing. At the end of the episode, Dr. Wong tells Rick that he went to great lengths to avoid being seen as someone who needed help. She notes that choosing to turn yourself into a pickle rather than attending therapy represents an enormous investment in avoiding emotional work. Rick's response is to belch and suggest they go get ice cream, completely dismissing her accurate observation. The therapy scenes themselves show the family discussing real problems while Rick is absent, demonstrating what he's missing by choosing avoidance over engagement. Rick's avoidance extends to how he deals with his family's emotional needs. When Beth expresses doubts about her life choices in The ABCs of Beth from Season 3, Rick responds by revealing that he created elaborate fantasy worlds for her as a child. Instead of having a conversation with Beth about her feelings, Rick shows her a fantasy world called Fruipyland that he built so young Beth could work through her violent impulses without hurting real children. Rick's solution to Beth's current dissatisfaction is to offer to make her a clone that can live her life while the real Beth goes on adventures. This is a technical solution to an emotional problem. Beth needs to talk through her regrets and make peace with her choices. She needs to process the trauma of Rick abandoning her as a child. Rick offers her dimensional travel and cloning technology instead. The offer allows Beth to avoid dealing with her real feelings, just like Rick avoids dealing with his. The clone offer reveals Rick's fundamental approach to human problems. He sees Beth's dissatisfaction with her life and thinks the solution is to give her a different life, rather than helping her find meaning in the life she has. He can't or won't engage with the emotional work of helping his daughter process her feelings. Instead, he offers her an escape through technology. The episode leaves it ambiguous whether Beth chose to be cloned or not, which itself represents avoidance. Rick's constant drinking serves as both chemical avoidance and a barrier to emotional connection. He maintains a state of intoxication that dulls his emotional responses and makes genuine conversation difficult. When family members try to have serious discussions with Rick, his drunkenness provides a ready excuse for why he can't engage properly. The drinking is itself a form of using substances to avoid dealing with psychological issues. And Rick's genius allows him to function at high levels despite being constantly intoxicated. Rick's flask is always with him. He drinks while working, while driving, while fighting, while having conversations, while alone, and while with others. The drinking is so constant that it's part of his character design and animation. The show establishes that Rick's baseline state is intoxicated, meaning he's using alcohol as a continuous buffer between himself and reality. This chemical barrier prevents genuine emotional connection because Rick is never fully present or sober enough to engage authentically. Rick creates devices that allow him to avoid uncomfortable social situations entirely. He has portal guns that let him leave any conversation by simply stepping through a portal to another dimension. He has technology that can erase memories, alter minds, or manipulate time. These tools give Rick an unprecedented ability to escape from emotional discomfort. When a conversation becomes too vulnerable, Rick can literally remove himself from reality rather than deal with his feelings. The episode, The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4, shows Rick using his genius in service of proving a petty point rather than for any productive purpose. When Morty suggests that Rick's vat of acid plan for escaping from a dangerous situation is bad, Rick becomes obsessed with proving Morty wrong. He creates an elaborate device that lets Morty save and reload his life like a video game. Rick then reveals that the device was fake, and all of Morty's reloaded lives actually happened to different versions of Morty across dimensions. When Morty undid things he didn't like, Rick actually moved him to a new dimension where those things hadn't happened yet, leaving the previous Morty to deal with the consequences. Rick did all this just to teach Morty a lesson about doubting Rick's plans. This episode demonstrates how Rick's need to be right and maintain intellectual superiority prevents him from having normal human relationships. A healthy person could accept criticism about a plan without becoming obsessed with revenge. Rick can't tolerate even small challenges to his authority or intelligence. He responds with elaborate technical demonstrations designed to humiliate the person who questioned him. His genius becomes a weapon he uses to maintain emotional distance and dominance over others. Rick's inventions often solve problems that wouldn't exist if Rick had better emotional skills. He creates devices to erase memories of bad experiences, rather than processing those experiences and learning from them. He builds technology to replace genuine human connection with artificial companionship. He invents ways to manipulate other people's emotions instead of developing empathy and understanding. Each invention represents an attempt to use intelligence and technology to bypass the hard work of emotional growth and healthy relationships. The butter-passing robot from Something Ricked This Way Comes in Season 1 serves as a metaphor for how Rick uses his genius. He builds an incredibly sophisticated robot with apparent consciousness and gives it the sole purpose of passing butter at the breakfast table. When the robot asks what its purpose is and Rick tells it to pass butter, the robot has an existential crisis and says, "Oh my God," in a devastated tone. Rick has created something capable of understanding meaninglessness and then trapped it in a meaningless task. This mirrors how Rick uses his own intelligence primarily for distraction and avoidance, rather than for anything genuinely meaningful. The robot's horror at discovering its purposelessness reflects Rick's own relationship to his capabilities, except Rick has chosen this emptiness for himself. Rick's relationship with his inventions reveals his emotional avoidance patterns. He pours tremendous effort into creating devices and technologies, but very little effort into maintaining relationships or examining his own psychology. He can spend weeks perfecting an invention, but won't spend an hour in honest conversation with his daughter. The intelligence that makes him capable of building portals to infinite dimensions is deployed to avoid the simple human work of being present and emotionally available to his family. The family notices this pattern even if they can't articulate it clearly, with Beth and Morty both showing signs of adapting to Rick's emotional unavailability by lowering their expectations of genuine connection with him. The show demonstrates this through Rick's inability to maintain relationships despite his supreme intelligence. He's smart enough to create artificial worlds and manipulate consciousness, but he can't figure out how to have a healthy relationship with his daughter or grandson. The skills required for emotional connection are completely different from the skills required for scientific problem solving. Rick's genius in one area doesn't transfer to the other area, and he keeps trying to force technical solutions onto emotional problems anyway. Rick uses his control over physical reality as a substitute for emotional control that he lacks. He can control dimensions, time, and matter itself through his inventions. This gives him tremendous power over the external world. However, he has almost no control over his own emotions, his addictions, or his psychological patterns. The contrast between his external control and internal chaos becomes more obvious as the series progresses. The edge Rick had from seeming untouchable dulls when viewers realize he's deeply out of control in the ways that actually matter for well-being. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Rick's use of intelligence to avoid emotional processing only worked while he maintained complete denial about his own damage, and the show began revealing that Rick knows exactly how broken he is. Section 5. Knowing he's broken. The transition from Rick as an untouchable nihilist to a character viewers recognize as damaged happened gradually. And a crucial step in that transition was the show revealing that Rick himself knows he's broken. Early Rick acted like his worldview and lifestyle were choices he made from a position of strength and clarity. Later seasons revealed that Rick understands his own dysfunction perfectly well and continues his destructive patterns anyway. This self-awareness without self-improvement removes much of Rick's edge because it transforms him from a character operating from philosophical conviction into a character trapped by psychological damage he recognizes but cannot or will not address. The clearest statement of Rick's self-awareness comes in Pickle Rick from Season 3, specifically in the therapy scene at the end of the episode. Dr. Wong, the family therapist, directly tells Rick what she observes about his behavior. She explains that Rick seems to believe that therapy is beneath him and that he's used his intelligence to avoid emotional processing. She notes that turning yourself into a pickle to avoid therapy demonstrates someone going to extreme lengths to avoid admitting they might need help. Rick's response is dismissive, suggesting they get ice cream instead of engaging with her observations. What makes this scene significant is that Dr. Wong is correct in her assessment, and Rick knows she's correct. He doesn't argue with her analysis or claim she's wrong about him. He simply refuses to engage with the truth she's speaking. Rick's dismissal isn't based on disagreement with Dr. Wong's conclusions about his avoidance patterns. It's based on his unwillingness to do the work required to change those patterns. This demonstrates that Rick understands his own dysfunction perfectly well. He just doesn't care enough to address it, or believes addressing it is impossible. Doctor. Wong continues by explaining that the best thing the family can do for each other is to go to therapy. She describes therapy as maintenance, comparing it to getting your car serviced regularly. Rick responds by saying the family should get ice cream, completely ignoring her point. This exchange reveals something important about Rick's relationship to self-knowledge. He can hear accurate assessments of his problems, understand that they're accurate, and still choose to do nothing about them. His intelligence includes the ability to understand his own psychology, which makes his continued dysfunction more deliberate than it would be if he were simply unaware of his issues. The episode The Old Man in the Seat from Season 4 explores Rick's self-awareness about his isolation and need for control. Rick has a secret toilet in an isolated location across space that only he knows about and uses. He goes to this toilet specifically because it's the one place in the universe where he can be completely alone and at peace. When someone else discovers the toilet and starts using it, Rick becomes obsessed with finding and confronting this person who has violated his private sanctuary. Rick eventually finds the person, an alien named Tony, and is prepared to kill him for using the toilet. However, Tony reveals that he comes to the toilet for the same reason Rick does. He needs a place to be alone with his thoughts, away from his job where he makes glowing rocks for a company that exploits his labor. Tony understands exactly what Rick is feeling, because they share the same need for isolation and the same existential despair about their lives. Rick sees himself in Tony and recognizes their shared damage. Rick and Tony develop a brief friendship based on this mutual understanding. They hang out together, both acknowledging that they're deeply unhappy people who need isolated spaces to cope with existence. The relationship demonstrates that Rick knows exactly what's wrong with him. He needs a secret toilet in space because he can't handle normal human connection and requires extreme isolation to feel at peace. He's aware that this is a dysfunctional coping mechanism. He sees this dysfunction clearly when he recognizes it in someone else. The self-knowledge doesn't lead to change or growth. It just makes Rick's continued isolation more obviously a choice rather than a circumstance. When Tony dies helping Rick with a different problem later in the episode, Rick is genuinely affected. He attends Tony's funeral and shows visible emotion. The episode ends with Rick at his secret toilet, now renamed in Tony's memory, sitting in isolation again. Rick has experienced a connection with someone who understood him, lost that person, and returned immediately to his old patterns. The episode makes explicit that Rick knows his isolation is unhealthy, and that he's capable of connection. Yet he chooses isolation anyway, because it's easier than the vulnerability required for sustained relationships. The backstory revealed in the Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 provides more evidence of Rick's self-awareness. Rick shows the Galactic Federation a fabricated memory of his wife Diane and young daughter Beth being killed by a bomb delivered through a portal. In this memory, Rick is driven to create portal technology specifically to find and get revenge on the Rick who killed his family. The memory shows Rick descending into obsession, creating the portal gun, and becoming the person he currently is. The episode reveals that this memory might be completely fabricated, a lie Rick tells to manipulate the situation. Whether the backstory is real or fake, the fact that Rick can construct this narrative shows he understands his own origin story and motivations. If the memory is real, Rick knows exactly what trauma created his current personality and has chosen not to address it. If the memory is fake, Rick understands himself well enough to construct a believable explanation for why he is the way he is. Either way, Rick has a clear understanding of cause and effect in his own psychology. Rick's claimed motivation for everything in the episode is getting Szechuan sauce from McDonald's, a sauce that was discontinued years ago. He says he's been driven by this desire for sauce all along. This is obviously a deflection, using absurdity to avoid admitting real emotional motivations, like protecting his family or maintaining his freedom. The deflection itself demonstrates self-awareness because you can only deflect from something you understand. Rick knows his real motivations and deliberately hides them behind a joke about sauce. The episode The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 has Rick explicitly acknowledge his bad parenting. When showing Beth the fantasy world he created for her as a child, Rick admits that he made Fruipyland because young Beth had violent tendencies and he needed to contain them. He tells Beth directly that she was a scary child who worried him. This admission shows Rick understands that his parenting choices, including abandoning Beth for years and then returning without explanation, have damaged his daughter psychologically. Rick's offer to clone Beth so she can escape her life while a clone lives it for her demonstrates his awareness that Beth is unhappy and that he bears some responsibility for that unhappiness. He's offering her the same avoidance strategies he uses himself, because he knows they work for avoiding emotional pain, even if they don't actually solve problems. Rick understands he's passing his dysfunction down to his daughter, and offers her tools to continue the pattern rather than helping her break it. Rick's relationship with alcohol provides constant evidence of self-awareness. He drinks constantly and heavily, maintaining a state of intoxication throughout almost every episode. This is clearly substance abuse, and Rick is too intelligent not to understand what he's doing to himself. He knows alcohol is a depressant. He knows his drinking levels are dangerous. He knows he's using substances to cope with psychological issues. The knowledge doesn't stop him from drinking because the drinking serves a purpose. It numbs him against reality and provides an excuse for avoiding emotional engagement. In autoerotic assimilation, after Unity leaves him, Rick drinks while preparing to kill himself. He's combining substance abuse with suicidal ideation, which demonstrates an understanding that his coping mechanisms aren't working. Rick knows his drinking doesn't actually solve his problems or make him happy. He does it anyway, because the alternative, dealing with his emotions sober, feels worse to him than the slow destruction of continued substance abuse. Rick's interactions with other Ricks at the Citadel reveal his self-awareness through comparison. The Citadel is a society of Ricks from different dimensions who have organized themselves into a civilization. Many of these Ricks are variations who made different choices or have different characteristics. When Rick visits the Citadel in episodes like Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind from Season 1 or the Ricklantis Mix-Up from Season 3, he expresses contempt for Citadel Ricks, who he sees as having sold out or given up. The contempt Rick shows for other versions of himself reveals that he understands what happens when Ricks try to build normal lives or societies. He sees the Citadel as Ricks who couldn't handle being alone and needed to create a society for mutual support. Rick views this as weakness because it means admitting you need others. His contempt for Citadel Ricks shows he understands the choice he's making to stay isolated. He's not alone because he has to be. He's alone because he refuses to seek out connection the way Citadel Ricks have. Rick's awareness of his own intelligence and what it costs him appears in several episodes. In Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3, Rick and Morty visit an alien spa that removes their negative traits and psychological toxins. Rick's toxic side, when separated, reveals confidence, intelligence, and ruthlessness without any restraint or conscience. The toxic Rick is everything that makes Rick capable and dangerous. The healthy Rick who remains is passive, uncertain, and much less functional. The episode suggests that Rick's genius and his psychological problems are interconnected. You can't have Rick's intelligence and capability without also having his arrogance, his cruelty, and his self-destruction. Rick's awareness of this connection means he understands that becoming healthier psychologically might cost him some of what makes him exceptional. He's choosing capability over health, knowledge over happiness, power over peace. This is a deliberate choice based on full understanding of the trade-off. Rick frequently makes statements that demonstrate self-awareness without self-improvement. He'll say things like, "I'm a terrible person," or acknowledge his destructive behavior, then immediately continue that behavior without attempting to change. This pattern of acknowledgement without change is actually worse than simple denial, because it shows Rick choosing his dysfunction consciously. If he didn't know he was doing damage, his behavior could be explained by ignorance. Since he knows and continues anyway, his behavior becomes more deliberately harmful. The show uses Rick's self-awareness to strip away any pretense that his nihilism and destructive behavior come from philosophical wisdom. Rick isn't a philosopher who has discovered difficult truths and lives according to them despite the cost. He's a damaged person who uses philosophy to justify patterns he knows are unhealthy. His intelligence allows him to construct sophisticated rationalizations for behavior he understands is dysfunctional. This transforms Rick from an enlightened figure into a self-aware tragedy. Rick's self-awareness also appears in how he treats Morty. He knows he's traumatizing his grandson by exposing him to danger and horror. He knows Morty is developing psychological problems from their adventures. In Mortonite Run from Season 2, Rick and Morty visit an arcade where you can experience another being's life. The place is called Blips and Chits, and Rick seems at home there, suggesting he visits regularly. The arcade serves as another form of escapism, another distraction from reality. Rick understands he needs these distractions and seeks them out consciously. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This self-awareness without change creates a new type of tragedy, where Rick's edge comes from knowing exactly what he is and choosing not to improve, which paradoxically makes him seem less cool and more trapped. Section 6. Emotional vulnerability breaks through. Rick's carefully maintained emotional armor began developing cracks that became impossible to ignore as the series progressed. The show started including moments where Rick's genuine feelings broke through, despite his efforts to suppress or hide them. These moments of emotional vulnerability fundamentally changed how viewers understood Rick's character. Instead of a genuinely detached nihilist who had transcended emotional needs, Rick was revealed as someone desperately trying to suppress emotions he actually felt quite strongly. This transformation from emotionally detached to emotionally suppressed removed much of Rick's edge, because suppression suggests weakness rather than strength. The suicide attempt in autoerotic assimilation from Season 2 represents the most dramatic early breach of Rick's emotional armor. After Unity leaves him, Rick returns home and goes to his garage. The scene shows Rick slowly preparing a device to kill himself, while sad music plays in the background. He writes equations on a whiteboard, methodically setting up the laser apparatus that will disintegrate him. He sits down beneath the device, positioning his head carefully in the path of the beam. He closes his eyes and waits for death. The camera holds on his face for several long seconds, letting viewers see the resignation and pain in his expression. This moment reveals that Rick's emotional detachment is a performance rather than his actual internal state. Someone truly detached from emotions wouldn't care about losing a relationship enough to attempt suicide over it. Rick's actions demonstrate that he's deeply attached to Unity, despite his philosophical position that attachments are meaningless. The contradiction between his stated worldview and his actual emotional reality becomes impossible to ignore. Rick isn't above feeling pain from loss. He just pretends to be until the pain becomes overwhelming and he can't maintain the pretense anymore. The scene works because it's uncharacteristically quiet and sincere. Rick doesn't make jokes or give speeches. He doesn't try to explain or rationalize what he's doing. He simply acts on his despair in silence. The lack of dialogue makes the moment more powerful because it removes Rick's usual defense mechanism of using words to deflect from feelings. We see Rick experiencing pure emotion without the filter of his intelligence or philosophy getting in the way. The silence forces viewers to confront the reality of what's happening without any of Rick's typical commentary to distance us from the emotional weight. The scene is also shot differently from typical Rick and Morty scenes. The camera moves slowly instead of with the show's usual frenetic energy. The colors are darker and more muted. The music is melancholy and sincere rather than ironic or upbeat. Every technical choice in the scene reinforces that this is meant to be taken seriously as a genuine moment of despair rather than as dark comedy. The show strips away its usual protective layers of humor and irony to show Rick at his most vulnerable. Only Morty's accidental interruption, when Morty stumbles into the garage drunk, saves Rick's life. Morty doesn't realize what he's interrupted. He's too intoxicated to understand the situation. He collapses on the floor before the laser activates, his body falling against a wire that powers the device. The laser never fires. Rick opens his eyes, sees Morty passed out on the floor, and the moment passes. The next day, Rick acts like nothing happened and never acknowledges how close he came to death. This pattern of experiencing overwhelming emotion, nearly acting on it, then suppressing any acknowledgement of what happened would repeat throughout the series. Rick's vulnerability exists in these moments, then gets buried again immediately afterward. The relationship with Unity itself demonstrates Rick's emotional vulnerability in ways that go beyond the suicide attempt. Unity is a hive mind entity that controls entire populations. When Unity and Rick are together, Unity uses controlled bodies to throw elaborate parties and experiences. They spend Rick's time with Unity engaging in hedonistic activities that seem shallow on the surface. However, the episode reveals genuine affection between Rick and Unity through small details in how they interact. They have private jokes and shared references that suggest long history together. They finish each other's sentences. They understand each other in ways that Rick doesn't connect with other beings. Unity brings out something in Rick that approximates happiness, or at least contentment. We see Rick relaxed around Unity in ways he never is around his family. His usual tension and sarcasm soften into something more genuine. He smiles without the smile being mocking or defensive. Unity represents someone who can match Rick intellectually, while also accepting his flaws without judgment. Unity has seen countless beings and civilizations and still chooses to spend time with Rick, which validates him in ways normal relationships can't. When Unity decides to leave Rick, Unity writes him a letter explaining the decision. Unity says that Rick makes Unity want to become less unified, to be more individual, to be worse at what Unity fundamentally is. Unity recognizes that the relationship is toxic and destructive for both of them, despite the feelings involved. The letter shows that Unity cares about Rick deeply, enough to leave him for both their sakes. Unity has to cut off the relationship to maintain Unity's own identity and function. Rick reads this letter, understands exactly what it's saying, and his response is to attempt suicide. This shows just how much the relationship meant to him and how little everything else in his life means by comparison. Rick's breakdown after losing Unity reveals that all his adventures, accomplishments, and power mean nothing when measured against his emotional needs. He can travel to infinite dimensions and build impossible technologies, yet he falls apart when someone he cares about leaves him. He can manipulate reality itself through his inventions, yet he cannot make himself not care about losing Unity. This contradiction exposes the emptiness beneath Rick's supposed self-sufficiency. He needs emotional connection, despite believing that need is weakness. When he loses connection, he loses the will to continue existing. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows Rick making a genuine sacrifice for his family that reveals his attachment despite his claims otherwise. The Galactic Federation comes to arrest Rick at Bird Person's wedding. Instead of fighting or escaping through a portal, Rick turns himself in to save his family from being arrested with him. He tells them he's doing this so they can have normal lives. Before turning himself in, Rick has a genuine moment with the family where they understand he's protecting them. He looks at each of them, and there's a weight to the moment that the show doesn't undercut with jokes. This sacrifice demonstrates that Rick does care about his family's well-being, despite constantly claiming that caring is irrational. Rick could have escaped alone through a portal, leaving the family to deal with the Federation. He could have taken his family with him to live as fugitives across dimensions. He chooses instead to sacrifice his freedom so they can have stability and safety. The choice reveals that Rick's actions often contradict his stated philosophy. He claims nothing matters, then makes significant sacrifices for people he claims are ultimately meaningless to him. The scene where Rick turns himself in plays out with surprising emotional honesty. Beth realizes what Rick is doing and tries to stop him. Summer doesn't fully understand what's happening. Jerry is confused and scared. Morty knows exactly what Rick is doing and what it costs him. Rick looks at Morty specifically before he goes, and there's acknowledgement between them of the sacrifice being made. Rick doesn't make speeches or explanations, he just acts to protect them, then leaves before they can argue or thank him. Rick's relationship with Bird Person provides another window into his emotional vulnerability that the show explores across multiple episodes. Bird Person is Rick's oldest friend, someone who fought alongside Rick in rebellions against the Galactic Federation years before the show's main timeline. When Bird Person gets married in The Wedding Squanchers, Rick gives a toast that appears cynical on the surface but contains genuine affection underneath. Rick talks about how love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed, describing it in the most reductive scientific terms possible. Yet he's at his friend's wedding, participating in the ceremony, showing up for someone he cares about. The fact that Rick is there at all speaks louder than his cynical words. When Bird Person is killed at his own wedding after being revealed as a Galactic Federation agent named Phoenix Person, Rick is visibly affected. He doesn't break down or show dramatic emotion, which would be out of character. However, his reaction demonstrates that the loss matters to him. His face changes. His voice becomes quieter. He processes what happened, and you can see it affecting him even though he doesn't verbalize his feelings. Later episodes show Rick trying to restore Bird Person, working to bring his friend back from whatever state Phoenix Person represents. Rick claims this is just a technical challenge, another project to work on. The effort Rick puts into restoration reveals that it's actually about recovering someone he genuinely cares about. The family therapy session in Pickle Rick from Season 3 shows Rick's vulnerability through his extreme avoidance. The entire episode is about Rick going to absurd lengths to avoid sitting in therapy for 1 hour. This avoidance itself is evidence of vulnerability, because someone truly detached wouldn't care enough about therapy to transform themselves into a pickle to avoid it. Rick's elaborate escape plan demonstrates that therapy threatens him, which means emotional examination threatens him, which means he has emotions he wants to protect from examination. When Rick does briefly attend the end of the therapy session after his pickle adventure goes wrong, Dr. Wong's observations clearly affect him, even though he pretends they don't. She accurately describes his avoidance patterns and his use of intelligence to escape emotional work. She notes that he went to extreme lengths to avoid being seen as someone who needs help. Rick's response is dismissive, suggesting they get ice cream instead. However, the fact that he bothers to respond at all, even dismissively, shows that her words landed. Someone genuinely unconcerned wouldn't need to deflect. They would simply not care what the therapist said. Rick's moments of protecting Morty throughout the series reveal his emotional attachment, despite his claims that Morty is just a device to hide his brainwaves from detection. In A Wrinkle in Time from Season 2, when time splits into multiple uncertain timelines, one timeline has Rick dying while another has Morty dying. Rick chooses to sacrifice his timeline collar, the device keeping him anchored to reality, to save Morty. He makes this choice knowing it might kill him. The only explanation for this choice is that Rick values Morty's life over his own, which contradicts everything Rick claims about Morty being merely useful. When both Rick and Morty survive due to the timeline collapse, Rick immediately covers his emotional action with a lie. He claims he knew the timelines would collapse in a way that would save them both. He frames his sacrifice as calculated rather than emotional. Morty doesn't believe this explanation, and neither does the audience. We've seen Rick make a genuine emotional choice to prioritize Morty's survival, then watched Rick lie about his own motivations immediately afterward. This pattern of emotional action followed by immediate emotional denial appears repeatedly throughout the series. Rick's vulnerability appears in small moments throughout various episodes that accumulate over time. There are scenes where his voice cracks slightly when discussing certain topics. There are moments where his expression changes before he catches himself and returns to his usual sardonic look. There are times when he starts to say something genuine before stopping himself and making a joke instead. These micro-expressions and near admissions paint a picture of someone constantly suppressing emotions that keep threatening to surface. The show uses these moments to deconstruct Rick's emotional armor, piece by piece. Each crack in the armor reveals that Rick isn't actually emotionally detached. He's emotionally overwhelmed and trying desperately to maintain control through denial and suppression. This distinction is crucial because detachment suggests strength, while suppression suggests weakness. A detached person doesn't feel the emotions. A suppressing person feels them but refuses to acknowledge them. Rick is the latter, which makes him seem more pathetic than powerful. Rick's drinking serves as both cause and evidence of his emotional vulnerability. He drinks to numb emotions he doesn't want to feel. The need to numb suggests the emotions are there and are powerful enough to require chemical suppression. If Rick truly didn't feel anything, he wouldn't need alcohol to not feel things. The constant drinking is Rick medicating himself against his own emotional reality, which reveals that reality is painful enough to require constant medication. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These emotional breakthroughs showed Rick as someone trying and failing to maintain detachment, and the show would further undermine his edge by making therapy and self-examination explicit threats to his identity. Section 7. Therapy as a threat to Rick's identity. The introduction of therapy into Rick and Morty, particularly through Dr. Wong in Pickle Rick from Season 3, represented a direct challenge to Rick's entire worldview and way of being. Therapy threatens Rick because it requires exactly what he refuses to do: honest self-examination, acknowledgement of emotions, acceptance of vulnerability, and commitment to change. The show's treatment of therapy evolved from something Rick could dismiss and avoid into something that exposed the limitations of his nihilistic philosophy. Understanding how therapy functions as a threat to Rick's identity helps explain why his edge dulled as the show took therapy seriously as a legitimate alternative to Rick's approach to life. Pickle Rick makes therapy the central conflict of the episode in a way that no previous episode had done. The setup is straightforward. Beth schedules family therapy and wants everyone to attend. This is a normal request that families make when dealing with dysfunction. Rick's response to this normal request is to transform himself into a pickle, using a serum he invented specifically to make attending therapy impossible. The transformation itself is Rick's statement about how he views therapy. He would rather become a vegetable than sit in a room and talk about feelings for 1 hour. The pickle transformation reveals Rick's priorities through the absurdity of his avoidance. Rick is willing to give up his human form, his ability to move or interact normally, and his opposable thumbs to avoid therapy. He plans this transformation knowing that he'll be helpless as a pickle until he can reach the syringe of antidote he's positioned in his lab. The plan shows Rick's contempt for therapy and his assumption that avoiding it is worth any cost or inconvenience. In Rick's mind, becoming a pickle is preferable to emotional honesty. The plan goes wrong when the family cat knocks the antidote syringe off the desk before Rick can reach it. Rick falls through a vent and ends up in the sewer system beneath the house. As a pickle, Rick is vulnerable to rats and other threats. Most people in this situation would accept defeat and ask for help. Rick, instead, builds a body using dead rat parts, cockroach legs, and other materials he finds in the sewer. He constructs a functioning exoskeleton controlled by his pickle body, creating something that looks like a horrific science fiction monster. Rick then fights his way through the sewers, killing numerous rats in brutal combat sequences. The episode depicts this violence with unusual detail for the show, showing Rick's pickle body covered in blood and viscera as he navigates the underground. Rick eventually emerges from the sewers and gets involved with a spy who helps him infiltrate a secure facility. Through a series of elaborate action sequences, Rick fights through the facility, killing guards and agents in increasingly creative ways, while still just a pickle with an improvised body. The entire sequence is Rick choosing to do incredibly difficult and dangerous things, rather than simply admitting he needs his family to help him, or that he was wrong to avoid therapy. He would rather kill dozens of people and fight through a secure facility than call Beth and ask her to bring him the antidote. The action sequences are entertaining and showcase Rick's resourcefulness and intelligence. However, they also demonstrate the lengths Rick will go to avoid vulnerability or admitting he needs others. When Rick finally returns home with a functioning body made from facility technology, the family is preparing to leave for therapy. Rick claims his pickle transformation was about working on a project and that he simply forgot about therapy. This is obviously a lie that nobody believes. Beth sees through it immediately. The family goes to therapy, and Rick reluctantly joins them at the end of the session, still wearing parts of his improvised body and covered in blood from the facility infiltration. Dr. Wong, the family therapist, delivers what becomes the most important speech in the episode, and one of the most important speeches in the series. She directly addresses Rick and explains what she observes about his behavior. She notes that Rick seems to believe therapy is beneath him and that he's too intelligent to benefit from it. She points out that he went to great lengths to avoid coming to therapy, lengths that required more effort than simply attending would have required. She tells him that the measure of a person is what they're willing to do when nobody is watching, and Rick chose to avoid being perceived as someone who needs help. Dr. Wong's observations are devastating, because they're completely accurate. She's identified Rick's core motivation for the pickle transformation in one conversation. Rick avoided therapy because attending would mean admitting he has problems that intelligence alone cannot solve. For someone whose entire identity is built on being the smartest person in any room, admitting that intelligence is insufficient for mental health would undermine his sense of self. Therapy represents submission to the idea that Rick needs help, which contradicts his belief in his own self-sufficiency. Dr. Wong continues by explaining that therapy is maintenance, like getting a car serviced regularly. She notes that people think therapy is for broken people, when actually therapy is for people who want to prevent breaking, or who want to fix breaks before they worsen. This framing challenges Rick's assumption that seeking help is weakness. Dr. Wong presents therapy as rational maintenance rather than shameful confession of inadequacy. For someone who prides himself on rationality, this reframing should appeal to Rick. The fact that it doesn't reveals that Rick's resistance to therapy isn't rational at all. Rick's response to Dr. Wong's accurate assessment is to suggest the family get ice cream instead of engaging with what she said. He dismisses her observations completely, making a joke to deflect from the serious points she raised. This dismissal is itself evidence that Dr. Wong's words affected him. Someone genuinely unconcerned wouldn't need to deflect. They would simply ignore the therapist or engage honestly. Rick's defensive humor shows that Dr. Wong identified something true that Rick doesn't want to examine. The episode makes clear that therapy threatens Rick specifically because it works. Dr. Wong is good at her job. She accurately identifies Rick's patterns after minimal interaction with him. She articulates his avoidance strategies in ways that expose them as dysfunctional rather than superior. If therapy were useless, or if therapists were fools, Rick could dismiss it honestly. The fact that Dr. Wong is perceptive and accurate means Rick has to actively reject truth rather than simply ignoring falsity. This makes his rejection more obviously defensive. The episode also reveals how therapy exposes the rest of the family's dysfunction. During the session before Rick arrives, Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty discuss their actual problems. They talk about how Rick's presence in the house has affected them. They discuss their relationships with each other and how the family dynamic has become unhealthy. Dr. Wong facilitates these discussions professionally, helping them articulate things they haven't been able to say to each other directly. The therapy session is productive for everyone except Rick, because everyone except Rick is willing to be vulnerable. Beth's participation in therapy is particularly significant because she starts recognizing patterns she learned from Rick. She admits that she uses intelligence and superiority to avoid dealing with emotions, just like her father does. She acknowledges that she's been unhappy for a long time and has used various distractions to avoid confronting that unhappiness. These admissions represent exactly what Rick refuses to do. Beth is willing to examine herself honestly, even when that examination is painful. Rick is not. The contrast between Beth's engagement with therapy and Rick's rejection of it shows that intelligence and self-awareness aren't enough for mental health. Both Rick and Beth are intelligent enough to understand their own patterns. Both can articulate what's wrong with their lives. The difference is that Beth is willing to do the work of changing those patterns, while Rick is not. Therapy requires not just understanding your problems, but committing to the difficult process of addressing them. Rick understands his problems perfectly well. He just refuses to address them. Dr. Wong represents a type of authority that Rick cannot easily dismiss. She isn't claiming to be smarter than Rick or to know more about science than he does. She's claiming expertise in a domain Rick has deliberately avoided learning about: emotional health and interpersonal relationships. Rick can't out-genius his way past therapy because therapy isn't about intelligence. It's about honesty, vulnerability, and willingness to change. These are areas where Rick's intelligence provides no advantage and might actually be a disadvantage, because he can construct sophisticated rationalizations for avoiding the work. The episode demonstrates that Rick's nihilism functions as a defense mechanism against therapy's implications. If nothing matters and all meaning is arbitrary, then psychological health doesn't matter either. Rick can dismiss therapy as just another meaningless human ritual with no objective value. However, his extreme avoidance of therapy reveals that he doesn't actually believe this. If therapy were truly meaningless, Rick wouldn't care about avoiding it. His transformation into a pickle shows that therapy threatens something Rick values: his identity as someone who doesn't need help. Therapy threatens Rick's self-sufficiency narrative. His entire personality is built around the idea that he's superior to normal humans and doesn't need the things they need. He doesn't need social bonds the way others do. He doesn't need hope or meaning or purpose. He doesn't need emotional support or validation. Therapy challenges all of this by suggesting that everyone, including Rick, has psychological needs that should be addressed through self-examination and relationship work. Admitting he could benefit from therapy would mean admitting he's not as different from normal humans as he believes. The show's treatment of therapy evolved after Pickle Rick in ways that further challenged Rick's worldview. Later episodes referenced therapy more often and treated it as something beneficial that the family continued doing. The family would mention going to therapy or reference things Dr. Wong said. These mentions normalized therapy as part of the family's routine, implicitly validating it as useful. The fact that the family kept going to therapy after the Pickle Rick episode suggested it was helping them, which meant Rick's rejection of it was increasingly obviously defensive rather than rational. Dr. Wong's character also represented a challenge to Rick's edge, because she was written as competent and perceptive rather than as a fool for Rick to outsmart. Earlier in the series, most authority figures and professionals were shown to be incompetent or easily manipulated. Rick could dismiss them because they were demonstrably wrong or stupid. Dr. Wong is neither. She accurately reads Rick and the family. She provides genuinely helpful insights. She can't be dismissed as easily as other authority figures could be, which makes Rick's dismissal of her look more like denial than superiority. The episode raised questions about whether Rick's intelligence is actually serving him well. If the smartest person in the universe is so psychologically damaged that he transforms into a pickle to avoid 1 hour of therapy, what does that say about the value of intelligence without emotional health? The episode suggested that Rick's intelligence enables his dysfunction rather than preventing it. He's smart enough to construct elaborate avoidance schemes, and smart enough to rationalize those schemes as reasonable. A less intelligent person might not be able to avoid therapy so effectively, which might mean they'd be forced to address their issues sooner. Rick's rejection of therapy also revealed his fear of change. Therapy is explicitly about changing patterns and behaviors that don't serve you well. Rick's refusal to engage with therapy means refusing to change. This refusal itself contradicts his supposed embrace of nihilism. If nothing matters, and all configurations of self are equally arbitrary, then there's no reason not to change. Rick's desperate preservation of his current patterns suggests they matter to him deeply, which contradicts his philosophy that nothing matters. The Pickle Rick episode became widely discussed and analyzed because it made explicit something that had been implicit. Rick's worldview is a defense mechanism rather than a philosophical achievement. Dr. Wong articulated what viewers had been noticing, that Rick uses his intelligence to avoid emotional work rather than to improve his life. The episode removed plausible deniability about Rick's dysfunction. After Dr. Wong's speech, viewers couldn't interpret Rick's behavior as evidence of transcendent wisdom. It was clearly avoidance and self-destruction that Rick chose to maintain. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The threat therapy posed to Rick's identity became even more serious as the show embraced serialization and continuity, making it impossible to reset everything back to normal after each episode. Section 8. Continuity weakens nihilism. One of the most significant changes in Rick and Morty over its run has been the shift from purely episodic storytelling to serialized narratives with ongoing consequences and character development. Early seasons featured mostly standalone episodes where events were contained and rarely referenced again. Later seasons increasingly embraced continuity, with events from one episode affecting future episodes and characters developing over time. This shift toward serialization fundamentally undermined Rick's nihilistic edge, because continuity makes things matter in ways that contradict the idea that nothing matters. When consequences persist and characters grow, nihilism stops being a viable philosophy for the show to maintain. Early Rick and Morty operated mostly on episodic logic, where each episode was its own self-contained story. In Season 1, Rick and Morty could have wild adventures that ended with everything essentially reset by the next episode. Characters didn't reference previous adventures unless the plot specifically required it. Morty could be traumatized by something in one episode and be back to his baseline personality in the next. Rick could nearly die or face serious consequences, and those consequences would disappear by the following week. This episodic structure supported Rick's nihilism because nothing had lasting weight. Each adventure was interchangeable with any other adventure. The lack of consequences made Rick's philosophy seem more viable, because consequences are what make actions meaningful. The major exception to this episodic structure in early seasons was Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1, where Rick and Morty permanently leave their original dimension after turning everyone into Croninberg monsters. This episode established that some consequences would persist. The family Rick and Morty left behind stayed in the Croninberg world rather than magically returning to normal. Morty's trauma from burying himself persisted in his character. The episode proved the show could do continuity, and that doing so made events feel weightier and more significant. This single episode demonstrated that when consequences last, events start to matter in ways that challenge nihilistic interpretations. However, Season 1 and much of Season 2 still operated mostly episodically. The show would occasionally reference previous episodes, and character relationships would develop somewhat, yet most episodes stood alone. Rick could claim nothing mattered, and the show's structure supported that claim by not making things matter across episodes. Adventures were disposable. Consequences were temporary. Nothing accumulated. This allowed Rick's nihilism to seem like an accurate description of the show's universe rather than just his personal philosophy. The episodic structure gave Rick's worldview structural support from how the show itself functioned. The shift towards serialization began gradually, but became more pronounced in Season 3 and beyond. Episodes started referencing each other more often. Character development from one episode would carry into future episodes. Relationships evolved over time rather than resetting. The show built toward season finales that resolved ongoing plot threads. This structural change meant that events within the show's universe began to matter in lasting ways. When things matter, nihilism becomes harder to maintain as a worldview, because nihilism depends on nothing having lasting significance. The most obvious serialized element is Rick's relationship with the Galactic Federation and his imprisonment between Seasons 2 and 3. The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 ends with Rick turning himself in to protect his family. The show doesn't reset this situation by the next episode. Instead, Rick remains imprisoned through the hiatus, and Season 3 begins with The Rickshank Rickdemption, which deals with Rick escaping from Federation prison. The consequences of Rick's sacrifice persist for months of real-world time and shape the beginning of the next season. This extended imprisonment showed the audience that major status quo changes could last rather than being resolved quickly. Rick's escape from prison has lasting consequences that ripple through multiple episodes. The Galactic Federation collapses because of Rick's actions, changing the political structure of the entire universe. The portal gun technology that Rick leaked causes chaos across dimensions. Beth and Jerry's marriage deteriorates partly because of the stress of Rick's imprisonment and the family living as fugitives. None of these consequences get reset. They continue to affect the characters and the world throughout Season 3 and beyond. The show commits to these changes rather than returning everything to a status quo. Beth and Jerry's divorce becomes a major ongoing storyline that demonstrates the show's commitment to continuity. In The Rickshank Rickdemption, at the end of the Season 3 premiere, Jerry gives Beth an ultimatum about Rick living with them. Beth chooses Rick over Jerry, and they separate. This separation isn't resolved quickly for a cheap reunion. Instead, the divorce is treated seriously and affects multiple episodes. Beth and Jerry date other people in ways that are shown on screen. The kids deal with their parents' separation in multiple scenes across different episodes. The family dynamic changes fundamentally, with Jerry living separately and visiting the kids rather than living in the house. The divorce storyline extends across multiple seasons before Beth and Jerry eventually reconcile. During their separation, the show explores how each character copes with the new situation. Summer struggles with feeling like she has to choose between her parents. Morty processes guilt about whether Rick's presence caused the divorce. Beth questions whether she made the right choice. Jerry deals with living alone and trying to rebuild his life. These emotional threads weave through many episodes, giving weight to the divorce as something that genuinely matters to everyone involved. The show's willingness to fundamentally change the family structure through divorce shows commitment to consequences that undermines Rick's nihilism. If nothing mattered, Beth and Jerry's relationship status wouldn't matter. The show could reset them to married at any time. Instead, the show treats the divorce as meaningful enough to shape an entire season's worth of episodes. The characters' feelings about the divorce matter. The impact on Summer and Morty matters. The show is explicitly rejecting the idea that relationships are interchangeable or that family configurations are arbitrary. Character development became more prominent as serialization increased. Morty in particular shows clear development across seasons. He becomes more confident, more capable, and more cynical as he accumulates experiences with Rick. The naive Morty from early Season 1, who could barely handle stress, is noticeably different from the more hardened Morty of later seasons, who takes dangerous situations in stride. The show tracks this development deliberately, showing how adventures with Rick change Morty over time. Episodes will reference how much Morty has been through, acknowledging the accumulation of traumatic experiences. This character growth contradicts episodic logic, where characters remain static. It also contradicts Rick's nihilism, because growth implies that experiences matter and shape who we become. Morty's growing competence specifically challenges Rick's control and superiority. Early Morty needed Rick for everything and followed Rick's lead even when scared. Later, Morty can handle dangerous situations independently, questions Rick's decisions more often, and sometimes outsmarts Rick or sees solutions Rick misses. The change isn't sudden or arbitrary. It's shown gradually across many episodes as Morty learns from his experiences. This gradual development only works if the show maintains continuity. Each adventure has to build on previous adventures. Knowledge and skills have to accumulate. Experience has to matter. Rick's relationship with his family also develops over time in ways that require continuity. His bond with Morty deepens, despite Rick's resistance to emotional connection. His complicated relationship with Beth gets explored across multiple episodes that build on each other. His interactions with Summer change as Summer proves herself capable and earns a place on adventures. These relationship developments only work if the show remembers previous interactions and builds on them. The show commits to making relationships evolve, which means treating them as significant rather than arbitrary. The show began including more callbacks and references to previous episodes as serialization increased. Characters would mention events from earlier episodes, the show would revisit locations or concepts from previous adventures. Inside jokes and recurring elements accumulated over seasons. These callbacks rewarded viewers who remembered continuity and reinforced that events from past episodes still existed in the characters' memories and experiences. When characters remember and reference past events, those events become part of the show's permanent history, rather than disposable stories. The Citadel of Rick storyline demonstrates the show's embrace of serialization. The Citadel appears first in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind from Season 1, gets revisited in the Ricklantis Mix-Up from Season 3, and affects later episodes as well. The show builds this location across seasons, developing its politics and society. We see the same characters appear at the Citadel in different episodes. We watch power dynamics shift over time. The Citadel exists as a persistent element of the show's universe, rather than a one-off concept that gets forgotten. The political evolution at the Citadel, including elections and regime changes, demonstrates commitment to showing how societies change over time. Evil Morty's storyline is the most prominent serialized narrative in the show, and the one that most directly challenges Rick's nihilism. Evil Morty appears first in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, returns in the Ricklantis Mix-Up, and becomes central to major plot developments in later seasons. His story builds across years of episodes. Each appearance adds to his characterization and moves his plans forward. The show treats Evil Morty as someone with consistent motivations working toward long-term goals. This kind of character can only exist in a show with continuity. An episodic show would either resolve Evil Morty's story immediately or abandon it. Evil Morty specifically represents a challenge to Rick's philosophy because Evil Morty takes action based on the belief that his actions can matter and change things. Evil Morty works to escape the Citadel and the infinite Rick and Morty dynamic. He believes freedom from Rick is possible and worth pursuing. His entire existence contradicts Rick's nihilism because he's trying to accomplish something meaningful. If nothing mattered, Evil Morty wouldn't bother trying to escape. His efforts imply that liberation matters, that agency matters, that his choices can create a better situation than his current one. The show's increased focus on Rick's backstory also required continuity. The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 shows Rick's memory of his wife Diane and young Beth being killed by a bomb. Later episodes reference this event and explore how it shaped Rick. Whether the memory is real or fabricated, the show commits to Rick having a past that explains his present. This narrative approach treats Rick as someone whose experiences accumulated to create who he is now. Early Rick seemed to exist without a past, springing fully formed from nowhere. Later Rick has a history that matters and shapes him. The show treating Rick's past as significant contradicts his stated philosophy. If nothing matters and all moments are equally meaningless, then Rick's past shouldn't affect his present. He should be able to dismiss his history as arbitrary. Instead, the show suggests that Rick's trauma and loss shaped his personality and worldview. His nihilism becomes a response to pain rather than an objective philosophical position. When nihilism is revealed as a trauma response, it loses its authority. It becomes something Rick tells himself to cope rather than a truth he's discovered. Serialization also makes Rick's self-destructive patterns more visible. When episodes are self-contained, Rick can get drunk and depressed in one episode without viewers tracking how often it happens. When the show maintains continuity, viewers notice that Rick is drunk in every single episode. The pattern becomes undeniable. The accumulation of Rick's drinking, his risky behavior, his cruelty to others, and his self-destructive choices builds into a portrait of someone spiraling rather than thriving. Continuity makes dysfunction visible in ways episodic structure can hide. The show's embrace of continuity means the wreckage of Rick's actions accumulates visibly. In an episodic show, Rick could destroy a planet or ruin lives, and viewers would forget by the next episode. In a serialized show, those destroyed planets and ruined lives stay destroyed and ruined. The Croninberg dimension still exists. The people Rick has harmed stay harmed. The relationships he's damaged stay damaged. When consequences persist, Rick's philosophy that nothing matters becomes harder to maintain, because clearly his actions had effects that continue mattering. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. As continuity made consequences impossible to escape, the show also began stripping away Rick's mystery and explaining his psychology in ways that turned his edge into something more sad than impressive. Section 9. The loss of mystery. Early Rick and Morty presented Rick as a character shrouded in mystery. We knew almost nothing about his past, his motivations, or how he became the person we saw on screen. This mystery was crucial to Rick's edge because it allowed viewers to imagine that Rick had discovered profound truths or experienced extraordinary things that explained his worldview. The less we knew about Rick, the more we could project onto him. As the show revealed more about Rick's history, psychology, and motivations, the mystery dissolved, and Rick became less impressive and more understandable. Understanding Rick made him seem more damaged than enlightened, which fundamentally changed how his character functioned. Season 1 Rick was essentially a blank slate in terms of backstory. The show gave us no information about where Rick had been during the years he was absent from Beth's life. We didn't know what adventures he'd had before reuniting with his family. We didn't know why he returned when he did. We didn't know if he had family elsewhere or what relationships he'd formed in other dimensions. This absence of information created space for Rick to seem mythologically significant. He could have done anything during those missing years. He might have legitimate reasons for his worldview that we simply didn't understand yet. The mystery extended to Rick's capabilities and knowledge. Early episodes showed Rick as supremely competent at everything he attempted. He could build impossible devices, speak alien languages, navigate any situation, and solve any problem. The show didn't explain how he acquired these abilities. We never saw Rick learning or studying. His knowledge seemed innate and complete. This made Rick feel almost superhuman, someone operating on a level normal people couldn't comprehend. The source of his abilities remained mysterious, which made them seem more impressive than if we understood how he developed them. Rick's relationships were also mysterious in early seasons. We knew he had a daughter named Beth, but didn't know details about their past. We didn't know if Beth's mother was alive or what happened to her. We didn't know why Rick abandoned Beth or what he was doing during the years away. The show hinted that Rick had connections across dimensions, but didn't explain those connections. This relational mystery made Rick seem like someone with a complex history that shaped him in ways we couldn't fully grasp. The mystery served Rick's edge by allowing him to seem unknowable. Characters who are fully explained become ordinary. Once you understand all their motivations and history, they lose their mystique. Early Rick maintained mystique by revealing almost nothing about himself. He would occasionally drop hints about his past, but these hints raised more questions than they answered. The fragments of information we received suggested depth without actually providing it. Rick seemed to have profound reasons for his behavior that were simply beyond our understanding. The Rick-Shank-Rick-Demption from Season 3 began dismantling Rick's mystery by showing his backstory. The episode includes a memory sequence where we see Rick as a younger man living a normal life with his wife Diane and young daughter Beth. They're a happy family. Rick is working on science projects in his garage, but hasn't become the interdimensional adventurer we know. Then a portal opens and another Rick appears, offering portal technology. When Rick refuses, the other Rick drops a bomb through the portal that kills Diane and Beth. This trauma drives Rick to create portal technology himself so he can hunt down the Rick who killed his family. The backstory explains Rick's nihilism as a response to devastating loss. Rick loved his family, and they were murdered in front of him. His wife and daughter were killed by another version of himself, which suggests that Rick's greatest enemy is himself. The trauma of this loss and the years spent hunting the killer transformed Rick into the bitter, damaged person we see in the present. This explanation makes Rick's worldview understandable. Of course, someone who experienced this would become nihilistic and detached. The philosophy becomes a coping mechanism rather than a discovered truth. However, the episode complicates this explanation by revealing that Rick might be fabricating the memory. He's showing this backstory to Federation agents while they have him imprisoned, and he's manipulating the memory to help him escape. The episode leaves it ambiguous whether the backstory is real or invented. This ambiguity preserves some mystery, suggesting we still don't know Rick's real history. Yet the ambiguity itself is revealing. Whether the backstory is true or false, it shows that Rick understands his own psychology well enough to construct a believable explanation for himself. Later episodes treated the backstory as at least partially real. Characters referenced Rick's dead wife. The show suggested that the trauma happened, even if some details were fabricated. This commitment to Rick having experienced this loss removed the mystery about why he became who he is. We now had a clear cause and effect. Trauma led to nihilism. Loss led to detachment. Pain led to substance abuse and self-destruction. Rick's psychology became a straightforward response to circumstances, rather than something more mysterious. The show also began explaining Rick's capabilities in ways that demystified him. Episodes showed that Rick's knowledge comes from experience rather than innate genius. He's been to countless dimensions and learned from each one. His abilities are impressive, but understandable as the result of accumulated experience over many years or decades. The mystery of how Rick knows so much dissolved into the mundane explanation that he's just very experienced. This made his capabilities less magical and more like skills anyone could theoretically develop, given enough time and motivation. Rick's relationships were also explained through increased focus on his family dynamics. We learned that Rick abandoned Beth when she was young and stayed away for years. We saw how this abandonment damaged Beth psychologically and shaped her into someone desperate for her father's approval. We learned that Rick returned partly because he needed Morty's brainwaves to hide his own genius from detection. These explanations grounded Rick's family relationships in practical and psychological realities rather than leaving them mysterious. The show revealed more about Rick's past adventures and connections through episodes featuring his old friends. Bird Person appeared in multiple episodes, and we learned about Rick's involvement in rebellion against the Galactic Federation. We saw that Rick used to be more idealistic and fought for causes he believed in. This younger Rick was different from present Rick, which suggested that time and experience had changed him. The change from idealistic rebel to cynical nihilist could be traced and understood. Rick's evolution was no longer mysterious. Squanchy, another of Rick's old friends, appeared and provided more context about Rick's past. The wedding and the wedding squanchers showed that Rick had a community of people who knew him well and cared about him. This contradicted the image of Rick as a complete loner. It revealed that Rick had chosen isolation rather than having it forced on him. He pushed away people who wanted to be close to him. This made his loneliness a choice, rather than an inevitable result of his nature, which made it seem more like dysfunction than philosophy. The Citadel episodes revealed that there are countless Ricks across dimensions, many of whom made different choices than our Rick. Some Ricks settled down. Some Ricks became politicians or businessmen. Some Ricks built communities with other Rick. The variety of Rick types demonstrated that being Rick doesn't automatically lead to nihilism and isolation. Our Rick chose his path when other options were available. This removed the sense that Rick's worldview was inevitable or profound. It was just one possible response among many. Evil Morty's storyline specifically challenged Rick's mystique by revealing the patterns that Rick follows. Evil Morty explained that all Ricks are essentially the same. They all think they're the smartest person in their universe. They all use Mortys as shields and companions. They all go on similar adventures and make similar choices. What seemed unique about our Rick was actually the standard Rick template. This revelation stripped away the sense that our Rick was special or had discovered something other Ricks hadn't. He was following the same patterns as every other Rick. The show's willingness to show Rick failing and being captured also demystified him. In early seasons, Rick seemed invincible. By later seasons, Rick regularly faced consequences and setbacks. He was imprisoned by the Galactic Federation. He was defeated by various enemies. He made mistakes that couldn't be easily fixed. Each failure demonstrated Rick's limitations and made him seem less godlike. A mysterious character can seem invincible because we don't understand their limits. An explained character has visible boundaries that constrain them. Rick's emotional vulnerabilities, once revealed, made him seem less enigmatic. The suicide attempt after Unity left him showed that Rick could be brought to despair by relationship problems. His obvious affection for his family, despite claiming to care about nothing, showed internal contradiction rather than mysterious depth. His therapy avoidance revealed fear of self-examination rather than transcendent confidence. Each emotional reveal made Rick more understandable and less impressive. The show also began explaining Rick's intelligence itself through episodes like Rest and Ricklaxation, where Rick's positive and negative traits are separated. The episode suggested that Rick's genius is connected to his psychological problems. You can't have one without the other. This explanation reduced Rick's intelligence from a mysterious gift to a specific neurological configuration with both benefits and costs. Understanding the source of Rick's abilities made them less magical. Rick's portal gun, his signature device, was also demystified through episodes showing its creation and limitations. We learned that Rick invented it after his family died. We saw that other Ricks have the same technology. We discovered that portal travel has rules and constraints. The portal gun stopped being a mysterious MacGuffin and became a comprehensible technology with explained mechanics. This made Rick's dimension-hopping adventures feel less special and more routine. The show's increased focus on Rick's substance abuse also removed mystery by framing his behavior as addiction rather than choice. Early Rick seemed to drink because he wanted to. Later Rick clearly drinks because he needs to. The drinking is compulsive rather than recreational. This reframing made Rick seem less like a powerful being who chooses hedonism and more like a sick person self-medicating. Addiction is understandable and pitiable, which works against mystique. Rick's relationship with Unity demonstrated that Rick functions better in relationships than alone. When with Unity, Rick seems happier and more functional. This contradicted the idea that Rick had transcended the need for connection. It showed that Rick withdraws from relationships because he's afraid of loss, rather than because he's evolved beyond needing them. This explanation made Rick's isolation seem like trauma response, rather than enlightenment. The show's willingness to parallel Rick with other characters also reduced his uniqueness. When Tony, in The Old Man in the Seat, shares Rick's need for isolation and existential despair, it shows that Rick's psychology isn't unique. Other beings across the universe feel the same way. This removed the sense that Rick had special insight or had reached a unique philosophical position. He was just one of many beings coping poorly with existence. Episodes showing alternate dimension Ricks with different personalities demonstrated that Rick's specific traits aren't inevitable results of his intelligence. Some Ricks are kinder, some are more social, some handle their trauma differently. Our Rick's specific combination of nihilism, alcoholism, and cruelty is one possibility among many, rather than the only possible result of being supremely intelligent. This made his edge seem like personal damage rather than philosophical achievement. The show explaining Rick removed the space for viewers to imagine him as something more than he is. When Rick was mysterious, viewers could project whatever made him seem most impressive. Some saw him as a tortured genius. Others saw him as someone who had discovered hard truths. Some imagined profound experiences in his past that justified his worldview. Once the show explained Rick, these projections became impossible. We knew what made Rick the way he is, and it was mundane trauma and poor coping rather than anything transcendent. The loss of mystery fundamentally changed Rick's function in the show. Early Rick could serve as a mysterious force of chaos who disrupted normal life. Later Rick was an explained character with understandable motivations and visible limitations. The shift from mysterious to explained made Rick more human and relatable, which worked for some storytelling purposes. However, it removed the edge that came from Rick being unknowable and potentially profound. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The explanations that removed Rick's mystery all pointed toward the same conclusion. His nihilism wasn't philosophy discovered through insight, it was psychology developed through trauma. Section 10. Nihilism as trauma response. One of the most significant shifts in how Rick and Morty portrayed its main character was the gradual revelation that Rick's nihilistic worldview isn't a philosophical position reached through reason and evidence. Instead, Rick's nihilism is a psychological defense mechanism developed in response to trauma. This reframing fundamentally changed what Rick's edge meant. Early Rick seemed to have discovered uncomfortable truths about existence that others were too weak to face. Later Rick was revealed to be using philosophy to avoid processing emotional pain. The transformation from philosopher to trauma victim removed Rick's intellectual authority and recast his detachment as a symptom of damage rather than a sign of enlightenment. The first major hint that Rick's nihilism might be trauma-based came from the Rick Shank Rickdemption in Season 3, which showed Rick's backstory involving the death of his wife Diane and daughter Beth. Whether this memory is real or fabricated, it establishes that Rick experienced, or believes he experienced, devastating loss. Watching your family get murdered in front of you would be traumatic enough to fundamentally alter anyone's worldview. The show suggests that Rick's current philosophy developed after this loss rather than before it. This timeline is crucial because it means Rick's nihilism is a response to pain rather than an insight into reality. The backstory implies that Rick wasn't always nihilistic. The younger Rick in the memory has a wife and child. He seems content working on science in his garage. He appears to have hope and connection and emotional investment in his life. When the other Rick offers him portal technology, he refuses it. This suggests that pre-trauma Rick made different choices than post-trauma Rick would make. The trauma of losing his family transformed him into someone who would obsessively pursue revenge and eventually become the detached, bitter person we see in the present. Rick's transformation from someone with a family and emotional connections to someone who claims nothing matters follows a logical psychological progression. Loss, especially sudden violent loss, forces people to confront the fragility of everything they value. Rick's specific loss involved his wife and child being killed by another version of himself, which would create additional psychological complications. The trauma wasn't just losing loved ones, it was losing them to a twisted version of himself, which would make trusting himself or other Ricks impossible. The years Rick spent hunting the Rick who killed his family show him developing the obsessive, self-destructive patterns we see in the present. The memory sequence shows Rick working furiously on equations, building devices, traveling through dimensions, seeking revenge. This obsession indicates someone who cannot process grief healthily and instead channels it into action. The obsession with revenge is itself a way of avoiding grief, because as long as Rick is pursuing the killer, he doesn't have to sit with the feelings of loss. When Rick eventually gives up the hunt or achieves his revenge, he's left with nothing. The purpose that drove him for years disappears. He's built tremendous capability and knowledge, but has no meaningful goals remaining. This psychological state, where someone has achieved their driving purpose and finds it hollow, commonly leads to nihilistic conclusions. Rick might interpret his own emptiness after revenge as evidence that nothing ultimately matters, rather than as a sign that revenge doesn't heal trauma. Rick's substance abuse clearly connects to trauma rather than philosophy. People who are genuinely at peace with meaninglessness don't typically develop severe addictions. Addiction indicates someone trying to escape or numb psychological pain. Rick drinks constantly, maintaining intoxication as his baseline state. This level of substance use suggests Rick is medicating himself against unbearable internal experience. The drinking is a trauma symptom rather than a philosophical choice. The show reinforces this interpretation through episodes showing Rick at his lowest points. After Unity leaves him in autoerotic assimilation, Rick attempts suicide. This suicidal depression appears after losing a relationship, which directly contradicts nihilistic philosophy. If nothing matters, then losing a relationship shouldn't affect you enough to want to die. Rick's extreme response to loss shows that he's not actually detached. He's emotionally raw and using philosophy to pretend he's not vulnerable when he clearly is. Rick's pattern of forming attachments and then pushing people away fits classic trauma response patterns. People with attachment trauma often create closeness but then sabotage it before they can be abandoned or hurt. Rick does this repeatedly. He gets close to Unity and then behaves in ways that drive Unity away. He clearly cares about his family but treats them poorly and pushes them away emotionally. He has friends like Bird Person, but maintains distance and rarely sees them. The pattern suggests someone who wants connection but fears vulnerability. Rick's intelligence and capabilities can be understood as compensatory strategies developed in response to trauma. After losing his family, Rick dedicated himself to becoming powerful enough that he would never be helpless again. He built devices that let him escape any situation. He gained knowledge that made him superior to almost everyone he encountered. He developed skills that meant he didn't need help from others. All of this capability serves to protect Rick from ever experiencing powerlessness like he did when his family was killed. The show explores this directly in The Old Man in the Seat from Season 4, where Rick connects with Tony over shared existential despair. Tony works a meaningless job and needs isolation to cope with existence. Rick recognizes himself in Tony immediately. When Tony dies, Rick is affected by the loss in ways that demonstrate his psychological damage. Tony's death reminds Rick of all his other losses. Rick's response to Tony's death shows that he hasn't processed his grief from earlier losses. Each new loss opens the old wounds. Rick's need for extreme control over his environment also indicates trauma response. People who have experienced profound helplessness often develop compensatory needs for control. Rick controls as much as possible through his intelligence and technology. He can't tolerate situations where he's not in control. His secret toilet across space, which only he knows about, represents his need for a space where he has complete control. The extreme measures Rick takes to maintain control suggest someone trying to prevent recurrence of traumatic helplessness. Dr. Wong's observations in Pickle Rick can be understood through a trauma lens. She notes that Rick went to extreme lengths to avoid being seen as someone who needs help. This avoidance is characteristic of trauma survivors who associate vulnerability with danger. Rick's transformation into a pickle to avoid therapy shows someone whose trauma has made vulnerability feel existentially threatening. He would rather fight through a secure facility as a pickle than sit in a room and acknowledge emotional needs. Rick's philosophy that nothing matters serves a specific psychological function if understood as trauma response. After experiencing devastating loss, believing that nothing matters protects Rick from caring about anything new that could also be lost. If he doesn't care, he can't be hurt. If everything is meaningless, then losing things is no worse than keeping them. The philosophy provides emotional armor against vulnerability. It's a defense mechanism rather than an insight. Rick's cynicism about love and connection makes sense as trauma response. He experienced love with Diane and lost her violently. He presumably loved his daughter Beth before abandoning her. These experiences taught Rick that love leads to pain. His cynical dismissal of love as just chemicals and evolutionary programming serves to protect him from acknowledging that he still wants and needs connection. The cynicism is armor against hoping for something he believes will inevitably cause pain. Rick's relationship with Morty specifically reveals trauma patterns. Rick claims Morty is just useful as a brainwave shield. This practical explanation lets Rick maintain emotional distance. However, Rick's actions show genuine care for Morty despite his words. He protects Morty, sacrifices for him, and shows concern when Morty is hurt. The gap between Rick's stated indifference and his actual behavior suggests someone who cares deeply but can't admit it because caring makes him vulnerable. The show increasingly frames Rick's genius as connected to his trauma rather than separate from it. In Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3, when Rick's toxic traits are separated out, the toxic Rick retains most of the confidence and capability. This suggests Rick's genius is intertwined with his psychological damage. You can't remove the trauma responses without diminishing the capabilities he developed in response to trauma. The genius and the damage are two sides of the same adaptation. Rick's inability to be happy, despite his capabilities, makes more sense as trauma response than as philosophical position. Someone who discovered that nothing matters through reason might feel liberated or at peace with meaninglessness. Rick is clearly miserable. He drinks constantly, attempts suicide, shows signs of depression, and engages in self-destructive behavior. This pattern fits traumatized and depressed much better than it fits enlightened. Rick's unhappiness is a symptom rather than an inevitable result of understanding reality. The show's treatment of Rick's age and experience also supports the trauma interpretation. Rick has lived for many years or decades and has seen countless dimensions and civilizations. This experience could theoretically support philosophical nihilism because he's seen enough to conclude nothing matters. However, the show suggests Rick's conclusions were formed early, possibly right after his family died, and his subsequent experiences simply reinforced beliefs he already held. He's not continuously discovering that nothing matters. He's continuously confirming what trauma taught him. Rick's resistance to change can be understood as trauma rigidity. Trauma often creates rigid patterns that feel safe even when they're dysfunctional. Rick maintains the same behaviors, the same substance use, the same emotional distance, and the same philosophical positions year after year. This rigidity protects him from the uncertainty and vulnerability that change requires. Someone genuinely comfortable with meaninglessness might be more flexible because nothing is at stake. Rick's inflexibility suggests he's protecting something he fears losing. Rick's reaction to Beth's therapy process reveals his trauma. When Beth goes to therapy and starts examining her life, Rick becomes uncomfortable. Her self-examination threatens him because it might reveal his role in her damage. Rick offers Beth the clone option in the ABCs of Beth, partly to help her escape self-examination, just like he does. He's teaching her his avoidance strategies, passing his trauma responses to his daughter. This intergenerational transmission of trauma patterns is common in families where parents haven't processed their own psychological damage. The show demonstrates that Rick's nihilism fails to protect him from pain. Despite believing nothing matters, Rick experiences intense suffering. He gets depressed, attempts suicide, grieves losses, and shows clear signs of psychological distress. His philosophy doesn't actually insulate him from emotional pain. This failure reveals that the nihilism isn't working as philosophy, even if it might serve some psychological function as a defense mechanism. Rick maintains beliefs that demonstrably don't improve his life because letting go of them would require confronting the trauma underneath. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding Rick's trauma didn't just explain his behavior, it removed the last barrier between viewers and seeing him as someone to pity rather than fear. Section 11. Explaining Rick softens him. One of the most significant ways Rick and Morty removed Rick's edge was by thoroughly explaining him as a character. Early Rick was mysterious, unpredictable, and difficult to understand. His motivations were unclear and his past was unknown. This mystery made Rick intimidating because viewers couldn't anticipate what he would do or why he would do it. As the show explained Rick's history, his psychology, and his emotional patterns, the mystery dissolved. Once viewers understood Rick completely, he stopped being intimidating and started being tragic. Explanation transformed Rick from a dangerous force into a sad character whose behavior follows predictable emotional patterns. The shift from mysterious to explained removed Rick's edge by replacing terror with sympathy. The process of explaining Rick happened gradually across multiple seasons. The show dropped hints about Rick's past in early episodes without providing full explanations. These hints suggested depth without actually revealing it. Rick would mention things he'd done or places he'd been without elaborating. He would reference relationships or events from his past without providing context. This selective revelation maintained mystery while suggesting that Rick had complex history shaping his present behavior. The fragments of information made Rick seem deeper than he might actually have been. The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 marked the beginning of thorough explanation by showing Rick's backstory. The episode included a sequence showing Rick as a younger man living with his wife Diane and young daughter Beth. They appeared to be a happy, normal family. Rick worked on science projects in his garage as a hobby rather than as his entire existence. When another Rick appeared through a portal and offered portal technology, Rick refused. The other Rick responded by dropping a bomb through the portal that killed Diane and Beth in front of Rick. This trauma drove Rick to invent portal technology himself so he could hunt down the Rick who murdered his family. This backstory provided a clear explanation for Rick's current personality. Rick became nihilistic and detached because he experienced devastating loss. He lost his wife and daughter to violence, which would traumatize anyone. The loss was particularly damaging because it was caused by another version of himself, creating psychological complications about identity and self-trust. The years Rick spent hunting the killer transformed him from a normal person into the damaged individual viewers see in the present. The backstory made Rick's behavior understandable as trauma response, rather than mysterious philosophical position. The show complicated this explanation by suggesting Rick might have fabricated the memory. He showed this backstory to Federation agents while imprisoned, and he was manipulating the memory as part of his escape plan. The ambiguity about whether the memory was real preserved some mystery. However, later episodes treated elements of the backstory as true. Characters referenced Rick's dead wife. The show suggested the trauma happened even if some details were altered. This commitment to Rick having this history meant viewers could understand Rick's present through his past. Once Rick's nihilism was explained as response to trauma, it lost its edge. Early Rick seemed to have discovered uncomfortable truths about reality that others couldn't handle. Explained Rick was coping poorly with grief and loss. These are very different interpretations. The first makes Rick impressive and intimidating. The second makes Rick sympathetic and understandable. Viewers who understand why someone acts a certain way stop finding them mysterious or threatening. They start feeling sorry for them instead. The show also explained Rick's substance abuse in ways that removed its philosophical edge. Early Rick drank constantly, and this could be interpreted as hedonistic choice or philosophical statement about meaninglessness. As the show progressed, Rick's drinking was increasingly framed as addiction and self-medication. Episodes showed Rick needing alcohol to function. His hands shook when he hadn't been drinking. He kept flasks hidden everywhere. He would prioritize getting alcohol over other goals. This pattern fit clinical alcoholism rather than philosophical hedonism. Framing Rick's drinking as addiction changed how viewers understood it. Addiction is a medical and psychological condition that generates sympathy rather than intimidation. Someone who drinks because they're addicted seems sick and needs help. Someone who drinks as a philosophical statement seems dangerous and unpredictable. The show shifted from the second interpretation to the first, which softened Rick considerably. Viewers stopped seeing his drinking as part of his edge and started seeing it as evidence of his damage. Rick's relationships were also thoroughly explained in ways that made him seem less mysterious and more psychologically typical. The show explored his relationship with Beth across multiple episodes. We learned that Rick abandoned Beth when she was young and stayed away for years. We saw how this abandonment damaged Beth and made her desperate for Rick's approval. We watched Beth struggle with whether to accept Rick back into her life, and how his presence affected her marriage and her children. This thorough exploration explained the Rick and Beth dynamic completely. Understanding Rick's relationship with Beth removed mystery and replaced it with very human dysfunction. Rick was an absent father who damaged his daughter through neglect. This is common and understandable rather than mysterious. Rick's inability to express affection for Beth, despite clearly caring about her, fits patterns that many people recognize from their own families. The relationship became relatable rather than alien. Relatable characters feel less intimidating than mysterious ones because viewers can map them onto their own experiences. Rick's friendship with Bird Person was explained through episodes showing their history together. We learned they fought together in rebellions against the Galactic Federation. We saw that Rick used to be more idealistic and committed to causes. We watched young Rick care about things and fight for them. This backstory showed that Rick changed over time, from someone more hopeful to someone more cynical. The change could be traced and understood as response to experiences. Rick wasn't born as the nihilistic figure we meet in Season 1. He became that person through understandable progression. Showing Rick's evolution from idealistic to nihilistic made him less intimidating. Early Rick could seem like he was born as a force of nature, someone whose nihilism was fundamental to his existence. Explained Rick was someone who lost hope gradually through painful experiences. The first version is mysterious and dangerous. The second version is tragic and sympathetic. The show chose to develop Rick in the second direction, which removed his philosophical edge while adding emotional depth. The Citadel episodes explained Rick by showing that countless other Ricks exist across dimensions, and many made similar choices. This revelation suggested that Rick's specific personality and worldview aren't unique. Other Ricks also abandoned their families. Other Ricks also became cynical and detached. Other Ricks also used Mortys as companions and shields. What seemed special about our Rick was revealed as standard Rick template. This explanation removed Rick's uniqueness and made him one example of a type rather than a singular mysterious force. Evil Morty specifically challenged Rick's mystery by explaining the patterns that all Ricks follow. Evil Morty laid out how Ricks operate. They think they're the smartest person in their universe, they use Mortys, they go on similar adventures, they make similar choices. Evil Morty's analysis demystified Rick by revealing him as predictable rather than mysterious. Once Rick's patterns were identified and explained, he stopped being unknowable. He became a character type that could be understood and anticipated. The show explaining Rick's intelligence also removed mystery. Episodes like Rest and Ricklaxation suggested Rick's genius is connected to his psychological problems. You cannot separate the intelligence from the damage. This explanation reduced Rick's abilities from mysterious gift to specific neurological configuration. Understanding where Rick's intelligence comes from and how it works made it less magical. Rick stopped being inexplicably brilliant and became someone whose brain works in a particular way that has both benefits and severe costs. Rick's portal gun and dimension hopping abilities were also explained, rather than left mysterious. The show revealed Rick invented portal technology after his family died. We learned that many Ricks have the same technology. We saw that portal travel has rules and limitations. The portal gun became a comprehensible technology rather than an incomprehensible MacGuffin. This explanation made Rick's signature ability feel less special and more routine. Other characters could understand and even replicate portal technology. Rick's greatest advantage was shown to be learnable rather than unique. The show's exploration of Rick's emotional vulnerabilities explained his defensive behaviors. Rick avoids therapy because he fears vulnerability. He pushes people away because he fears loss. He maintains emotional distance because closeness makes him feel exposed. He uses intelligence to avoid emotional processing because feelings are more difficult for him than physics. Each of these patterns was demonstrated and explained across multiple episodes. Viewers came to understand exactly why Rick acts the way he does. This thorough psychological explanation removed any sense that Rick operates on a level normal people cannot understand. His behaviors follow predictable patterns based on trauma, fear, and avoidance. These patterns are common enough that many viewers recognize them from their own lives or from people they know. Rick's psychology became textbook rather than mysterious. Viewers could diagnose Rick's problems and understand his motivations completely. This understanding replaced intimidation with sympathy. The show also explained Rick by showing him fail repeatedly. Early Rick seemed nearly invincible. Later, Rick faced regular defeats and setbacks. He was captured by the Federation. He was outsmarted by enemies. He made mistakes with serious consequences. He failed to prevent losses and tragedies. Each failure demonstrated Rick's limitations and made him seem more human. Mysterious characters seem more powerful than they are because we don't understand their limits. Explained characters have visible boundaries that constrain them. Rick's attempt to kill himself after Unity left him served as a major explanation of his emotional state. The scene showed viewers that Rick experiences profound despair. He reaches points where he wants to die. This revelation explained that Rick's nihilism doesn't actually protect him from pain. He suffers intensely despite his philosophy. Understanding this suffering made Rick seem broken rather than transcendent. Viewers stopped seeing him as someone who had mastered meaninglessness and started seeing him as someone drowning in it. The show explaining Rick's need for control as response to traumatic helplessness also softened him. Rick controls everything he can because he once experienced profound powerlessness when his family was killed. This explanation made sense of Rick's obsessive need to dominate situations. It reframed control from strength to compensatory behavior. Someone who needs control because they fear helplessness seems anxious and damaged rather than powerful and intimidating. Rick's relationships with Unity and Tony were explained as Rick seeking connection with beings who understand his psychological state. Unity is a hive mind who can truly know Rick. Tony shares Rick's existential despair. These relationships show Rick seeking understanding and companionship from beings who won't judge him. This searching for connection contradicts Rick's claims to have transcended emotional needs. The contradiction explains Rick as someone who wants connection despite fearing it. This makes him relatable and sympathetic rather than mysterious and intimidating. The more the show explained Rick, the more predictable he became. Viewers learned to anticipate Rick's emotional responses. They knew Rick would push people away when they got close. They knew Rick would drink when faced with feelings. They knew Rick would use intelligence to avoid vulnerability. They knew Rick would act cruel to protect himself from appearing weak. These predictable patterns removed the sense that Rick might do anything. He became a character whose responses followed clear psychological rules. Explaining Rick transformed him from mysterious force into case study. Early Rick was unknowable and therefore dangerous. Later Rick was thoroughly understood and therefore sad. The transformation served the show's evolution toward emotional depth and character study. However, it completely removed Rick's nihilistic edge by replacing philosophical mystery with psychological explanation. Once viewers understood Rick as a damaged person coping poorly with trauma, they could no longer see him as a powerful being who had transcended human weakness. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This thorough explanation of Rick raises questions about what kind of show Rick and Morty wanted to be, and what the loss of Rick's edge means for the series overall. Section 12. What the loss of edge means. The transformation of Rick from untouchable nihilist to explained trauma victim represents a fundamental shift in what Rick and Morty is as a show. Early seasons presented dark philosophical comedy where nothing was sacred and everything was meaningless. Later seasons presented character-driven drama about damaged people learning to process emotions and connect with each other. Both approaches create entertaining television, yet they are different shows with different goals. Understanding what was lost and gained through Rick's transformation helps explain why the show changed and what that change means for how we understand the series as a whole. Early Rick and Morty was genuinely transgressive in ways that few television shows managed to be. The show presented a protagonist who rejected almost every conventional value and seemed to be right within the show's universe. Rick's nihilism wasn't portrayed as wrong or as something he needed to overcome. It was simply how Rick operated, and his worldview was validated by his success. He could do things other characters couldn't do precisely because he was willing to reject meanings and values that constrained others. This made the show feel dangerous and unpredictable in ways that challenged viewers to question their own assumptions. The danger came from the sense that anything could happen because the show's main character believed nothing mattered. Rick could abandon his family, destroy civilizations, or kill people without remorse because his philosophy freed him from normal constraints. This created real tension because viewers couldn't predict what Rick would do based on conventional moral reasoning. The show could go places that other shows wouldn't go because Rick would go places other characters wouldn't go. This unpredictability gave early episodes genuine power to shock and disturb viewers in ways that felt meaningful. When Rick abandoned the Croninberg dimension in Rick Potion number 9, the show demonstrated its willingness to follow nihilistic philosophy to logical conclusions. Rick didn't fix his mistake or learn a lesson. He simply left and moved on. This ending violated normal storytelling conventions that would require Rick to face his actions or show remorse. Early Rick and Morty was willing to violate those conventions, which gave the show real edge. Viewers couldn't trust that the show would provide conventional resolutions or moral lessons. This lack of safety made watching the show feel genuinely risky. The episode also showed Rick taking Morty with him when he left, forcing Morty to bury his own corpse and live with that trauma. The show presented this as something that happened without judgment or commentary. Rick didn't apologize to Morty or acknowledge the psychological damage this would cause. The show simply showed events unfolding according to Rick's philosophy that nothing matters enough to worry about consequences. This approach to storytelling felt genuinely different from other television. The comedy in early seasons worked through discomfort. Rick's nihilism created situations where normal emotional responses collided with philosophical detachment. Morty would be traumatized by burying his own corpse, and Rick would be completely unaffected. This contrast created dark comedy that required genuine difference in how characters processed events. The humor was in the gap between normal human reactions and Rick's complete absence of reaction. Viewers had to sit with the discomfort of watching terrible things happen while the main character treated them as meaningless. This specific type of comedy stopped working once Rick was revealed to care deeply despite claiming otherwise. When Rick acts cold after viewers know he's actually hurting, the coldness reads as defense mechanism rather than philosophical position. The humor changes from shock at genuine detachment to recognition of psychological avoidance. The later version perhaps shows more sophisticated understanding of psychology, yet it lacks the raw edge that came from presenting a character who genuinely didn't care. The comedy becomes about recognizing patterns of avoidance rather than about confronting genuinely disturbing philosophical positions. Early Rick also functioned as effective social commentary. His nihilism served as a lens for examining cultural assumptions and social conventions. Rick could point out absurdities in how society operates because he stood outside those systems. When Rick mocked marriage, employment, or government, the mockery had edge because it came from someone who had genuinely rejected those institutions. Rick's position as outsider gave his commentary weight and made it feel genuinely challenging rather than just cynical complaint. Rick's speech at Bird Person's wedding in The Wedding Squanchers, calling marriage a funeral where you smell your own corpse, worked as comedy and commentary. The speech mocked marriage from a position that appeared to be outside it. Rick seemed to offer perspective from someone who had transcended the need for such conventions. The commentary felt sharp because it appeared to come from a genuine philosophical position rather than from emotional damage. Viewers could take Rick's observations seriously as critique of social institutions rather than dismissing them as the complaints of someone who wishes he could participate. The show's shift toward emotional depth changed what kind of commentary it could provide. Later, Rick couldn't serve as detached critic because he was no longer detached. His criticisms lost their edge because viewers knew Rick was critiquing from a place of pain rather than genuine disinterest. When someone who desperately wants connection mocks connection, it reads as defensive. The commentary became less cutting because the commentator was revealed to be compromised by his own emotional needs. Rick's observations stopped feeling like outside perspective and started feeling like rationalization. The serialization of the show fundamentally changed its relationship with nihilism. Episodic structure supported nihilistic philosophy because events didn't accumulate. Each episode could be wild and consequence-free because nothing carried over. This structure matched Rick's philosophy that nothing matters because the show itself acted like events didn't matter beyond their immediate entertainment value. The form and content aligned perfectly in early season. Squared structure contradicts nihilism because it makes things matter across time. When events persist and affect future events, the universe demonstrates that actions have weight. Morty's trauma from the Croninberg incident carrying forward shows that experiences matter and shape people. Beth and Jerry's divorce, lasting multiple seasons, shows that relationship changes matter. The structure itself argues against the philosophy that nothing matters. Every callback to a previous episode or reference to past character development contradicts Rick's stated worldview. A serialized show about nihilism faces inherent contradiction between its structure and its philosophy. Rick and Morty chose serialization, which meant choosing against the nihilistic philosophy that defined early Rick. The show wanted to tell stories with emotional weight and character development. These goals require continuity and consequences. The decision to embrace serialization was effectively a decision to reject nihilism as the show's operating philosophy. The show's structure began arguing against Rick's philosophy even before the characters explicitly did. Once the show committed to making things matter, Rick's insistence that nothing matters became obstacle rather than foundation. Rick's nihilism prevented the kind of character growth that serialized storytelling requires. Characters who believe nothing matters have no reason to change or improve. The show had to either maintain Rick's nihilism and sacrifice emotional storytelling, or develop emotional storytelling and sacrifice Rick's nihilism. The show chose the second option, which meant fundamentally altering Rick's character. This choice transformed Rick and Morty from philosophical comedy into family drama with science fiction elements. Later seasons focus heavily on the family's dysfunctional dynamics and their struggles to form healthy relationships. Rick's adventures provide backdrop for exploring these relationship dynamics. The science fiction elements serve the emotional stories rather than the other way around. The show became about people rather than about ideas. Episodes increasingly centered on emotional conflicts within the family rather than on philosophical questions raised by Rick's adventures. The transformation serves some storytelling purposes effectively. Character-driven drama allows for different types of emotional payoffs than philosophical comedy does. When Rick and Morty reconcile after a fight, it can feel meaningful because the show has invested in their relationship. When Beth and Jerry work through marriage problems, viewers who care about them feel satisfaction. These emotional moments work in serialized character drama in ways they couldn't work in episodic philosophical comedy. The investment viewers make in characters over time creates opportunities for emotional payoffs that episodic comedy cannot achieve. However, the transformation also lost something valuable that early seasons provided. The show became less willing to genuinely challenge viewers' assumptions and values. Early Rick questioned everything, including the value of questioning itself. Later Rick questioned things from a position viewers understood as defensive. His challenges to conventional values were revealed to come from pain rather than from genuine philosophical inquiry. The intellectual challenge that made early episodes genuinely provocative disappeared as Rick's motivations became transparent. The show became safer in its provocations because even its most challenging elements were revealed to come from trauma. Rick could no longer make viewers deeply uncomfortable by presenting views that might be correct despite being disturbing. The show stopped genuinely challenging whether conventional values like family and connection are actually meaningful. It ultimately affirmed those values by showing that Rick's rejection of them made him miserable. This affirmation made the show more conventional, even when surface elements appeared edgy. The loss of edge also meant the loss of a specific type of humor that depended on shock and discomfort. Early Rick and Morty could create moments of genuine transgression where the show seemed to cross lines that television normally respects. Later Rick and Morty operates within more conventional boundaries, even when it appears not to. The show can show violence and say offensive things, yet it does so from a place that ultimately affirms conventional values, like family and connection. The appearance of edge without actual edge creates different comedy than genuine transgression does. The show's treatment of therapy represents this shift perfectly. Early seasons would have positioned therapy as another meaningless human construction that Rick could dismiss without being proven wrong. Later seasons present therapy as legitimate and helpful. Dr. Wong is competent and insightful. Her observations about Rick are validated by the show rather than mocked. This represents the show choosing emotional health over philosophical consistency. Therapy requires believing that improving emotional state matters and that personal growth is valuable. These beliefs contradict nihilism directly. By validating therapy, the show validates the idea that meaning exists and that working toward better mental health is worthwhile. The question of whether Rick and Morty's transformation improved the show depends entirely on what viewers value in their entertainment. Someone who loved early seasons for their transgressive edge and philosophical darkness might find later seasons disappointing. They might feel the show betrayed its original premise by ultimately affirming the very values it started by questioning. They might miss the genuine discomfort that early episodes created. Someone who values character development and emotional depth might find later seasons more satisfying. They might appreciate the show's willingness to explore Rick's psychology deeply and show real character growth. Neither position is wrong, they're simply preferences for different types of storytelling. What's undeniable is that Rick lost his edge. The character who began as television's sharpest nihilist became television's most thoroughly explained trauma victim. Rick's journey from untouchable philosophical force to sympathetic, damaged person mirrors the show's journey from provocative philosophical comedy to emotional family drama. The transformation was gradual enough that many viewers didn't notice it happening episode by episode. Comparing early Rick to late Rick reveals a character who changed completely in every meaningful way. The show now operates with Rick as someone who needs help, who makes mistakes, who learns lessons, and who grows as a person. These are all conventional character arc elements that early Rick explicitly rejected. The show affirms that connection matters, that family matters, that emotional processing matters, and that meaning can be found through relationships and personal growth. These affirmations directly contradict the nihilistic foundation the show began with. Rick and Morty became something fundamentally different from what it started as. Rick and Morty became a show about people finding meaning in a meaningless universe, rather than a show about someone who had genuinely rejected meaning. This represents fundamentally different premise, with different goals and different appeals to audiences. The shift from philosophy to psychology removed Rick's edge by changing what kind of character he was and what kind of show this was. The show transformed from asking whether meaning exists into showing how damaged people create meaning despite their trauma. For viewers who loved Rick's edge, the loss is real and significant. They watched television's sharpest nihilist become television's most explained trauma victim. They saw a character who represented genuine transgression become someone who needed therapy and family connection. The edge that made Rick dangerous and exciting was stripped away through explanation and serialization. What remains is a well-developed character in an emotionally complex family drama, which is valuable in its own way, though different from what the show started as. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.